So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad ashraf al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Today, we're going to hopefully look more in depth at the concept of Iman and then Ihsan. The hadith, which is the second one mentioned in the book by Imam Nawawi, the 40 hadith, is a hadith that was uttered about 80 days before the Prophet ﷺ actually died. So it's considered the best overview of the Islamic tradition. And in the hadith we saw that the first question was asked was about Islam. And the 5 pillars were given to express what Islam was. And then the next question was about Iman. And then it followed by a question about Ihsan. And then about a question about time, the end of time. If you look in terms of trying to understand this thing in terms of dimensions, you can see these as 4 dimensions within Islam. The dimension of Islam itself would be the dimension related to the earth. In other words, Islam is an outward practice. Anybody can be a Muslim, including a hypocrite. In other words, even a person who does not believe in Islam can be a Muslim. That is possible. So that is the first dimension, and that is one-dimensional Islam. Just as you have one-dimensional Christianity, one-dimensional Judaism, or any other tradition. We're simply going through the motions. The tradition is not impacting us in any way. And this is, I like to call it religion, because I think religion fits into that category. What we term as religious people. I have a friend who was a crack cocaine addict, and then he left that, and he became Muslim, and he ended up, now he works for the state of California as he's the head, or he was appointed by the governor there to be on the task force for drug rehabilitation. And he told me once that, he said, a religious person is somebody afraid of going to hell. But he said, but a spiritual person is somebody been to hell and doesn't want to go back. So, religion is, obviously, some people have identified the human being as a religious creature. And religion, if you look at the original idea there, it's religio means to bind together. Which is not really, that concept does exist, and I think it exists in the Islamic tradition as well. The idea, one, you could look at it at a higher level of binding a person to God. But at its more sociological level, it's binding a group of people together. We're bound together by what Ibn Khaldun called asabiyya. Right? What holds us together is some type of homogeneity in our beliefs, in our understandings, and our worldviews. And this is what the postmodernists would call a grand narrative. You have a grand narrative that we all fall under. So we share a commonality. And traditionally, religion has definitely provided this aspect in cultures. And this is why people who were of minority status in a culture were people that did not tend to share that homogeneous worldview. Like in the Western civilization, certainly the Jewish tradition has always been marginalized by not only an ethnicity, but a worldview. They were different. The same can be said about the Catholics in this country for a long time. The Anglo-Saxon Protestants had very strong numbers, and when the Catholics began to immigrate to this country, there was a lot of problem created because there was a different worldview there. Now, if we move to the next dimension, which is Iman, and this is the dimension of, if Islam is the horizontal dimension or the dimension of width, then this is the dimension related to a vertical motion. In other words, Iman relates to a person's connection with the Creator or with God in Islam. So Islam is an outward practice that is keeping people together, and there are social rules that we adhere to. When you move into Iman, this is why are we doing it. It transcends simply the act of doing it, but moves into the realm of why. Why are we practicing these things? The reason that the Quran gives should be for God alone. And that would be your vertical dimension of Iman. Now in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is asked, what is Iman? أخبرني عن الإيمان. Now interestingly enough, in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ does not actually define Iman, but rather gives us the objects of Iman. What is implied in the hadith is that this is something that the Arabs understood what Iman was. And just to go in, and I want to digress here just for a second. In this talk, we're going to be looking a lot at Arabic terms, and I'll explain why. First of all, the Muslims believe that the Arabic language is a language of revelation. In other words, it has a unique status amongst other languages. Now, the Muslims would say that that is true about the Hebrew language. That is probably true about the language of Sanskrit. Probably true about some original Chinese language, and possibly true about some of the Indo-European languages like Greek. But traditionally Greek is seen as more what they call a sacerdotal or a priestly language, as Latin was for the Roman Catholic Church, Greek was for the Greek Orthodox Church. In the Muslim tradition, Arabic is definitely part of the worldview of the Muslims. And there's a theory in linguistics, Sapir-Whorf theory of language, which is also the language relativity theory, which is the idea that a language is not simply a means of communication, but embedded in the language is a worldview. In other words, that individuals articulate their worldview through their language. And this is important. Now, just to give you a good example of that, the word in English for reality, right, is related to a Latin word. Does anybody have Latin? Know that word? Res. Does anybody know what res means in Latin? Thing. Really good. I'm glad. Got some old Latin people around here. Res equals thing. Now, that's a very interesting concept right there. In other words, embedded in the language itself is they're telling you what we think about reality. Reality is thing. There is an inherent materialism in that word. You see, there's an inherent materialism in that word. Now, to take an example of the word in Arabic for reality is haqiqa. The root word is haq, which is an al-haqqu means the real. And it is one of the 99 names of God. So embedded in the Arabic language, the perception of reality is already related to something that is beyond this. It is related to the divine. There is an idea, in a sense, that reality itself is not what we are experiencing in the realm of things, but actually transcends the realm of things. Because in the Islamic tradition, God is not a thing. God is not a thing. The word in Arabic for thing is shay. And shay is it comes from a word which means that which is willed into existence. So thing is something that emerges into existence from non-existence. So reality transcends thing in the Islamic worldview. Reality transcends thing. So within the Arabic language, we're going to see certain semantic fields that are created by these triliteral roots, that are based on these three roots, that are articulating something very important about reality. Now, if we look at the word iman, which is faith, it's translated generally as faith, iman. Its root is three letters. Alif, Mim, Nun. Amina means to be safe or secure. To be safe or secure. Iman is a verbal noun that comes from, there's 15 forms of every verb. So you literally, each verb is going to create a whole semantic field by which you'll get nuances of the meanings of the word. Iman is from a fourth form out of the 15 forms that literally means to make oneself safe and secure. So the idea here is that faith is an anchoring element in the human experience. And lack of faith is something that creates a type of trouble, of turbulence within the psyche itself. Now we can see this if you're going into surgery. You'll hear somebody say, well, I have faith in my doctor. Because you don't want to go into surgery not having faith in your doctor. You're going to be a wreck, right? You're going to be a wreck. There's going to be a lot of trauma related to that experience. So the idea of faith as a securing factor in the human condition. Now there's a wonderful, in the Greek tradition, Prometheus gives man fire, which is knowledge. And then Prometheus is cursed by the gods, because the gods don't want to have man to have knowledge, because man's going to compete with the gods. Prometheus, once he's on the rock in Aeschylus' play, and he's Prometheus bound, and they're asking him what he was given, what he gave to man. He said, I gave him fire and I taught him the crafts, right? And then he said, what else? And he said, I gave him faith. In other words, without faith, the human being is in a hopeless state, right? So there's an idea that we need faith. If we have all the knowledge in the world, if we know how to do all these things, but we don't have faith in the future, in tomorrow, we go into a state of despair. And human beings cannot function in a state of despair. A study that they did with rats, where they would put a rat, I mean, this is horrible things that scientists do, but sometimes they come up with interesting results. They put a bunch of some rats in in water, and then they would let the rats swim until they would drown, right? Well, what they started to do, they'd time it, and they'd say the rats would survive a few minutes. Right before the time that they would normally drown, they would pull them out and save them, and they would do this over and over again. Then they would leave those same rats who had been pulled out and saved, and they would go sometimes twice or more than they would normally do had they not been pulled out of the cauldron. So the idea is that even the rat has a concept of hope. That even the rat, as insignificant as its brain is, has a concept of hope. That I might be saved, so I'm going to hang on a little longer. Now there's a story, one man asked a man once if he believed in God. He said no. And he said, well, let me ask you something. He said, if you fall off a ship in the middle of the ocean, do you just give up? And he said, no, I continue to swim. And he said, why? And he said, out of the hopes of being saved. And he said, that's God. You see that there is within us this odd mechanism in our own psyches that says, I'm not going to give up. And this is rooted in this idea of wanting to make oneself secure, of wanting to be in a state of security. So the believer, according to the Islamic tradition, is called a mu'min, somebody who is making themselves safe. How? How do you make yourself safe? In a world of absolute change, we see change everywhere. We have no sense of security in this world. And a person who's in a secure state is in a delusional state. Really, if you think about this. If you feel secure at all times, then you're in a delusional state. Especially in California, right? Right? Because I live in California, we hear those shakes every once in a while, just to remind you, it's not that secure, right? We are literally, as human beings, constantly exposing ourselves to death in every instant. Each breath is an exposure to death. And because of that, there's a deep instability. Now, there's a type of veiling that takes place as a mercy. Because if we were constantly aware of this state, right, we would be literally wrecks, psychological wrecks. And there are people that go into these states. One of the things Lewis Thomas mentions in one of his essays is the whole fact that nature, right, which is often a scientific word for God, that nature does this wonderful thing of veiling death from us. Even though there's death all around us, you don't see dead animals everywhere. That they're hidden. That you can literally go down this road and go for a long walk and you won't see a dead creature. And yet there's death all over the place. There's death happening, decay. It's happening all over the place. But there's a type of veiling, right? And this enables a human being psychologically to maintain hope for the future. So Iman, or belief, is related in making oneself secure. The first object of belief that will secure an individual, according to the Islamic tradition, is Iman Billah, which means belief in Allah. Now, we know that, all of us know now, that the first statement of the Muslims is La ilaha illallah. And this is usually translated as there is no God but Allah, which I think in many ways is problematic. It leads a person who is not an Arab or not a Muslim to think that Allah is some kind of, there's no God but Allah. In other words, there's no God for the Christians, there's no God for the Jews, there's no God but this God that the Arabs are calling Allah, which is problematic. Because Jewish Arabs call God Allah and Christian Arabs call God Allah. You see, a Christian Arab calls God Allah, and they call Jesus Ibnullah, the son of Allah. That's what a Christian Arab calls. A Palestinian Christian says, the son of Allah. So this is a linguistic determination from the Arab people for what we know in English as God, which is originally probably an Indo-European word, gut, which you get, it goes into Persian as khuda. Right? The Persian word, don't tell any white supremacists, but the Persian word khuda is related to the English word for God, because then it goes into German as gut or Gott. And the original word here is related to the one who is called on when there's no one else to call on. That is God. God is the one we call on when there's no one else to call on. Now, the word Allah in the Arabic language does not designate a meaning. We do not know what it means. Some of the Muslims think that it is originally from ilah, right? The word ilah, and obviously you can see the linguistic similarity there. The Orientalists would definitely say yes, it's got to be. It's just a lamb, it becomes Allah because it's al-ilah, and they take the two lambs together and make it Allah instead of saying al-ilah. The word ilah, it has a plural, it has a masculine and a feminine, right? It has a masculine and a feminine. It also has negative connotations in the Quran as well, whereas Allah does not have negative connotations. Ilah can have negative connotations in the Quran. Allah does not. Allah always has a positive connotation in the Quran. The root word of ilah is aliha, which means to bewilder, to create bewilderment. And this would be consistent, for instance, with San Anselm's idea of God being that which nothing greater can be conceived. That it's the thing that the intellect literally short circuits when it tries to conceptualize. It creates a type of bewilderment in the psyche for us to try to imagine infinity. Infinity, we can't imagine it. We can imagine it as an abstract concept, but we can't really conceptualize the idea of infinity. It's something we can only abstract it, but we cannot grasp the true idea of infinity. And so Allah, when we say La ilaha illallah, there are two things happening here. The first is called nefi, which is a negation. And the second is called ithbat. Oops. Which is an affirmation. The idea for the Muslims is you must negate before you can affirm. What are you negating? You are negating everything other than Allah. And this is the idea where reality is related to this word al-haq, the real. In other words, the Muslims say, and the nice thing about Arabic, and one of the many nice things, is it does not have the verb to be. So in this, although we read it in English, there is no God but God. In Arabic, that is, which we call an auxiliary verb, I think. Yeah. The is not there. It's not there. Now this has important philosophical implications because when you relate to the idea of being, again we can move out of being when we talk about God. See, the Muslims don't view God as a being in the sense of a supreme being in a hierarchy, like the St. Thomas Aquinas idea of a hierarchy of being, God being at the top of the hierarchy. That's really alien to the Islamic tradition. The idea of God here is that God is absolute, that God is ultimate reality, that God, when God's reality is articulated, every other reality vanishes into falsehood or non-existence. This is utter transcendence, in the sense that when we talk about God at one level in the Islamic tradition, we are talking about the radical other. We are talking about that which has no association with anything created. That when we even compare the created to this reality, creation in a sense disappears. Creation has a type of unreality. For the Muslims, what this means is we can supplant any of these words here with the divine names or the attributes. We can say there is no haqq except the haqq. In other words, there is nothing real except the real. We can say there is no generous except the generous. Al-Karim is the name of God. We can say there is no merciful except the merciful. So we can literally take any of the 99 names and put them in this formula and it works. Why? Because when we speak about God, we are negating everything other than God. And this relates to God's absolute greatness, the magnificence of God.
Philosophically, it seems like you're saying God is other, but what about God's immanence?
I'm going to get to that. I will. I'll get to that. Because this is a very important point. So when we negate, what we are saying is La ilaha. Although we read it in English, there is no God but God. In Arabic, that is, which we call an auxiliary verb, I think. Yeah. The is not there. It's not there. Now this has important philosophical implications because when you relate to the idea of being, again we can move out of being when we talk about God. See, the Muslims don't view God as a being in the sense of a supreme being in a hierarchy, like the St. Thomas Aquinas idea of a hierarchy of being, God being at the top of the hierarchy. That's really alien to the Islamic tradition. The idea of God here is that God is absolute, that God is ultimate reality, that God, when God's reality is articulated, every other reality vanishes into falsehood or non-existence. This is utter transcendence, in the sense that when we talk about God at one level in the Islamic tradition, we are talking about the radical other. We are talking about that which has no association with anything created. That when we even compare the created to this reality, creation in a sense disappears. Creation has a type of unreality. For the Muslims, what this means is we can supplant any of these words here with the divine names or the attributes. We can say there is no haqq except the haqq. In other words, there is nothing real except the real. We can say there is no generous except the generous. Al-Karim is the name of God. We can say there is no merciful except the merciful. So we can literally take any of the 99 names and put them in this formula and it works. Why? Because when we speak about God, we are negating everything other than God. And this relates to God's absolute greatness, the magnificence of God.
Philosophically, it seems like you're saying God is other, but what about God's immanence?
I'm going to get to that. I will. I'll get to that. Because this is a very important point. So when we negate, what we are saying is La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha. The sun, la ilaha. The moon, la ilaha. The stars, la ilaha. All of this, la ilaha. There is nothing that I can see, that I can conceive, that I can point to, except that I have to say la ilaha.
What is the difference, that concept that's held, and the concept such as that a Christian religion?
I think that they can be very similar. I think many Christians will believe this. In fact, the Muslims believe that this is almost really, it's a universal understanding. Right? The Muslims would believe that La ilaha illallah is a universal understanding. But it's quite radical in its implications, and I'm going to get to that related to Tawheed and how this translates into the world, how we behave and act in the world. When we say illallah, this is the affirmation. So negation precedes affirmation in the Islamic tradition. Negation precedes affirmation. We have to negate other before we can affirm what is real or what is true. All right? Now, if we think, you know, many Muslims will say, if somebody says to them, I don't believe in God, then a Muslim would want some clarification. What do you mean by God? Because we might not believe in the same thing. Right? In other words, that there are many people in this time, certainly, that have rejected more traditional concepts of God. And if you move into, in a sense, the Durkheimian view of God, which is really that human beings project, that we project, or the Freudian view, that again human beings felt insecure, they wanted to create a big daddy up in the sky that's going to take care of all of us, makes us feel secure. This is the idea within a modern Western view that in a sense God is a psychological mechanism that enables a human being to create some psychic stability. And there are people that reject that. There are people that reject that idea. From the Muslim point of view, the Muslims would say that belief in God is part of the fitrah nature. It is inherent to the individual. The Quran uses a word which is called fitrah, which means the original nature. The aboriginal nature of the human being is called fitrah. And that is that human beings are, by their nature, believers. They are believers. The problem is, the belief is not full, it is not a correct belief because of a misunderstanding about ilah. So you have animists. Animists believe in something outside of themselves. Right? Or you have somebody that associates with God, that believes that there's duality. For instance, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, or multiplicity of gods in Hinduism. And even if you get into the Brahman, I mean the Brahmins kind of, what they don't tell the other people is that they really don't believe in the idols. Right? At the highest level of Hinduism, these are kind of simple ways of allowing people that have not evolved enough. They haven't moved into the Brahman class, which takes several lifetimes, right? But the Brahmins can understand God as the Atma, or that which does not have form. So they do have a concept of a formless God, right? Nirguna. They do have that concept. But the Muslims would say all of these ways of viewing or understanding God, if they are not preceded by negation, will fall into an incorrect understanding. And the idea is that the intellect cannot know God except through God. There is a fitrah nature, which is to recognize that God exists, to recognize that there's something outside of myself. But the intellect is not sufficient enough to understand God as God wants to be understood. And this is where we get revelation. So the next object of faith, right? Amantu billahi wa bi kutubihi. There's books. There are dispensations. So the books are dispensations from God in which God explains to His creation what He wants them to understand about Him. So from the Muslim perspective, every group has had this reminder. And it's interesting that it's called a reminder. These books are called reminders. The Torah was a reminder. The Gospel was a reminder. If the Vedic scriptures were revealed books originally, they were reminders. If Buddha was a prophet, he was a reminder. Bringing people reminders, taking them back to their true nature. which is to understand God. That the human being was created to understand God. And God is the highest abstraction for the human being. We have nothing higher in terms of abstraction. The human being does have a concept of God. Even the atheist has a concept of God. So the intellect has the ability to conceptualize really that which cannot be conceptualized. It's paradoxical, but this is the power of the intellect. Was telling me about the most sophisticated computer in the world that has the brain of the same intelligence as a flatworm, right? And I said, I just said, that's amazing. He said, that's not amazing. This is amazing. You see, the human intellect is what's amazing. The human intellect is phenomenal in its capacity to imagine, to conceive, to conceptualize, to idealize. I mean, this is something very extraordinary. And the Muslims see it as a gift. The aql is a gift. It's the crown of creation. And a gift should be used for that which it was intended, according to the Islamic tradition. Mm-hmm.
What about emotion?
Emotion?
Because intellect can be something that is clear, that is concise, that is unfeeling, insensitive.
Right. Okay, again we get into definitions and semantics. From a Muslim point of view, the intellect is not really what is conceived in the West to be intellect. In the West, the intellect is really seen as this rational, analyzing, critical. I mean, the kind of height of intellectual prowess is seen in the scientist, in a sense. Whereas from the Muslim point of view, the intellect relates really to perception. And compassion might be the necessary thing to be perceived. In other words, that the intellect... What's that?
You're saying it's all encompassing.
I think so. I think it's a broader understanding of intellect. In other words, the intellect really is that which sees things as they truly are. And when I asked one of my teachers what intellect was, he said it's a light that God puts in the heart in which people are able to see things as they truly are. Right? So the intellect is an organ of perception. And if it perceives things as they truly are, then the emotive faculty within the individual might be stimulated by the perception of something as it truly is. So if I see somebody suffering and my intellect understands truly what that means, then empathy emerges. So that is part of the function of the intellect. You see, so the intellect would be necessary to, I mean, if you look at it in a tri-brain type thing, I'm going to go into that just about the nafs. All right? So some of these questions I will get to, and if you want, just hold them, just so I can keep...
The flow.
Huh?
Keep the flow.
Trying to move along. The books. So the books are dispensations. Now, the Muslims do not know how many books there were, but we are told to believe by the Quran with absolute certainty in 4 books. The first one is called the Torah. And the Torah, generally, most of the Muslims believe it relates to the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So you'd have Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, right? Those would be generally considered the first 5 books. Now it's important that the Muslims do not... The book that, the Bible is collected over 900 years. From the Quranic worldview, there were alterations, and we talked about that already. So when the Muslims say they believe in the Torah, it does not necessarily mean everything that exists in the Torah today. So for instance, stories that would denigrate the prophets, the idea that Lot, for instance, slept with his daughters, things like that are anathema to the Muslims. They really would not accept that as being from the revelation. And these are differences between the religious teachings, but that is the Muslim worldview. The gospel would be the gospel of Jesus, gospel in singular, not the 4 accounts, but a gospel, one gospel called the Injil. And then the Zabur, which is generally believed to be the Psalms of David. And then finally the Furqan, or the Criterion. And it's called the Furqan in relation to the other 3 books because it's seen as the discriminating book. In other words, it lets us know what is still valid from those other books and what is no longer valid. This is how the Muslims view the Quran, that it is a book, it is a criterion for judging other traditions. And the Quran says that it's muhaymin alayh, that it is literally an overseer of the other traditions. So that Now, the books themselves are brought by messengers, which is the next. We have to believe in messengers. And the idea of a messenger, a Rasul, is somebody that is sent from God to human beings to give them a message from God, to explain God's intentions or will towards the human being. Both the books and the messengers are understood to be sent by God. Now, there is a response to the messenger, and it is either Iman or Kufr. Now, Kufr, you'll most often see it translated in books as disbelief. Kafir is a non-believer or a disbeliever. That is not a good translation for Kufr. The Islamic worldview sees Kufr, if you look at the root meaning of it, it is from a root word ka-fa-ra, which means, the active participle in Arabic means a farmer. Because what a farmer does is they cover a seed with dirt. They put a seed into darkness. Now the idea there is that kufr is covering over something. That is the root of it. So in a sense, kufr is seen as truth concealing. The truth is concealed. The idea there is it's really known that a person in truth cannot be a disbeliever from the Islamic perspective. No one can be a disbeliever in truth. And the greatest truth concealer is Iblis in the Islamic worldview. And Iblis was one of the closest to God. So the idea is that really this is not about disbelief. This is about concealment. This is about hiding or covering up. And that's how the Quranic worldview sees truth in relation to how people respond to it. They will either accept it, and that's why they're called acceptors rather than believers. They will accept it, or they will conceal it. Now, there are many ways to conceal the truth, and certainly many, many Muslims are truth concealers in reality. You see, so I can be a Muslim, and here I am doing all my right things and everything, but in reality, I am concealing the truth. The essence of truth concealing is ingratitude. The human being, a kafir, is also called an ingrate. The idea is that if God in His bounty, because the actual idea of sending messengers is good intention. In other words, that God has a good intention towards His creation. That if God simply created the human being, threw away the manual, and just said, work it all out for yourselves. And everybody spends their life in turmoil and darkness and moving out, right? You like the, Mullah Nasruddin is a character in the Middle East. They tell stories about him. And one of the stories, Mullah, he was in the tavern all night, and he goes out in the early morning, wee hours of the morning, and he's wandering around the city aimlessly. The policeman comes up and he says, Mullah, what are you doing out at this time? And he said, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be at home in bed. The idea is that this is the state of many, many people. They're literally wandering around in a drunken stupor, and they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. And there are many, many diversions. There are many ways to conceal the truth. Right? Rumi talks about the many wines that God has put on this earth to put people out of their misery. He said Jesus was drunk in the love of God, and his donkey was high on barley. There's many ways that we can deal with the human condition, right? Like John Lennon said, whatever gets you through the night, right? There are many people that have that attitude. I'm just going to get through this, whatever it takes. That, from a Muslim perspective, is a type of ingratitude because the messengers have come. They have given people news. They have given people guidance. That the guidance is there, and that is why the truth concealer is the one who is ingrate. He's an ingrate because he or she is not accepting that truth. And this is the Muslim view of looking at these two phenomena, of how we respond to revelation. Now another mullah story that kind of is another way of looking at this is that mullah was looking around one day for something, and somebody came by and he said, mullah, what are you looking for? He said, some keys I lost. And he said, he starts helping him, and after about an hour or two, he's saying, listen, where exactly do you think you lost them? He said, oh, way over there. He said, well, what are you looking here for? He said, it's better, the light's better over here. Right? So there's an idea also that people will go where it's easy instead of going where it's hard. And this is also a type of truth concealment, to go where it's easy instead of going where it's hard. So the messengers are human beings, first and foremost. And they have a type of capacity that other individuals do not have, although we have a glimpse of it. And this is why the Prophet Muhammad said, a true dream is 1/46th of prophecy. 1/46th of prophecy. And anyone has access to a true dream, including, from the Muslim worldview, somebody who is not a Muslim can have a true dream. And this is an access, it is 1/46th of prophecy. In other words, it is an indication for the human being of the idea that we can know something that has not happened yet. And this happens to people. They will have a dream, a prescient dream, and then the actual it happens. What is that? See, for many people, they don't understand. It happens to people, but they don't understand what it is. Or what we call déjà vu. Right? In French, the idea of, I've been here before. What's going on? This is a type of remembrance. According to the Islamic tradition, we are remembering something. And this is, I think it's related to the Platonic tradition of memory as well. Plato felt that what we were here doing was simply remembering, right? That we are in a state of forgetfulness. And this is related in the Quran to the idea of ghafla. Ghafla is heedlessness or forgetfulness. That the human being by nature is forgetful. If you look at it in terms of Vanity Fair, and many of the scholars have used this analogy in commentaries. The servant is sent by the king to go to the marketplace and get something. But on the way to the marketplace, there's a fair. I've got plenty of time, sun's high, I'm going to go look at the fair. He goes into the fair, and then suddenly, entertainment. Suspension of disbelief. Preoccupied. Gets lost in the fun. And before he knows it, the sun's gone down. Oh my God. The king sent me to the marketplace is closed, and I wasted my time in the Vanity Fair. This type of metaphor is related to this human condition, which is ghafla, that we become immersed in a type of heedlessness, that the world by its nature is powerful, in that human beings become preoccupied. So how do we remind ourselves? How do we pull ourselves out of the Vanity Fair and remind ourselves daily that this is the world is temporal, and there is a journey coming. From the Muslim perspective, it is the reminder itself. Ad-dhikr.
Is God not immanent in the world?
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. I know you guys want to get let's get to the juice here. Immanent or transcendent. And the answer is yes, no. But I'll get to explaining that. People are overpowered. The prophets come. Now, interesting, there are 4 obligations according to the Islamic tradition for the prophets. The first one is truthfulness. They have to be truthful. They don't lie. The next is trustworthiness. They're trustworthy. If he says he's going to be here tomorrow, he's there. The third is conveyance, that they convey the message. And the fourth is wakefulness, fatana. The messengers are wakeful beings. They are individuals who have woken up to the truth. And we, in a sense, are like the cave dwellers of Plato's analogy. We are the people looking at the shadow world. and believing this is reality. The prophets are those who have gotten out of the cave. They've seen the real world. They come back and they say, it's not those shadows. Don't be fooled. It's not. You're just seeing shadows. That is not the real world. They've seen the real world. They come back and they say, it's not those shadows. Don't be fooled. It's not. You're just seeing shadows. That is not the real world. These are images projected by a light. There's something out there that's real. Right? And this is the idea that the messengers come to wake people up, remind them, get them into a state of remembrance, not forgetfulness. Get them into a state of remembrance. So ghafla is the opposite of dhikr, or remembrance. So in the Quran there are juxtaposed heedlessness and remembrance. Heedlessness and remembrance. Now, when the prophets come, they tell people, La ilaha illallah. The belief in the Quran is that no messenger has come except that he has said, La ilaha illallah. That is the universal message of all prophets. What will change is the second part of the Shahada. For the Muslim, it is now Muhammad Rasulullah. At one time it was Isa Rasulullah. At another time it was Musa Rasulullah. Jesus is the messenger of God. Moses is the messenger of God. Noah is the messenger of God. Possibly Buddha is the messenger of God. The Native American people here had prophets, had people that came to them to tell them about the nature of reality and the truth. So the idea from the Muslim perspective is that all peoples have been given these people that remind them, that tell them. Now, because of the power of the world and the unknowability of God, we move into the realm of paradox. And this is where we'll get to how we understand God in terms of God's creation. In the Western philosophical scheme, there are two concepts, transcendence and immanence. Transcendence is the otherness of God. Immanence is the knowability of God, the presence of God. For the Christian, the immanence of God would be through Jesus Christ. Would be through Jesus Christ. That is how God became known to man. Right? God so loved man that he became man. That idea. That this is how the human being can know God. For the Hindu, the immanence is through the worship of forms, of idols. How then is God immanent for the Muslims? Because if we have the utter otherness of God or unknowability of God, how then, as an individual, do we feel any closeness to God? If God is so exalted and so above the creation, how do we feel any intimacy with God? For the Muslim, the immanence of God and the transcendence of God are related to two fundamental concepts about God. One is Rahmah, and the other is Ghadab. Whoops. Oh, opposite. Yeah. I want to get it there, right? That's where you want it. Justice. And you get the point. I mean, I could go on and on. There are many, many examples. This is the immanence of God. And this is the transcendence of God. It's interesting that the Quran begins, Bismillah, Allah is a transcendent name of God. It's not an immanent name of God. It's a transcendent name. There is actually nothing we can associate with the name Allah, according to the Muslims. But then the next two names are Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. That is, out of the three names that we are given at the beginning of the Quran, there are two relating to mercy and one relating to this transcendence or otherness. This is consistent with the Islamic worldview because the Quran says, my mercy is over my wrath. That the dominant quality that Allah is showing His creation is mercy, not wrath. But wrath is there. This also relates to two and very important concepts which are termed fear and hope. Now, if you want to look, because Muslims, like the traditional Christians, as above, so below. Right? What Durkheim and everybody, they turned it upside down. As below, so above. In other words, we're just projecting our world here on the other world. Fear is related to the father. The father for the child in traditional worldviews, not so much in the American type of ideal now, but in traditional worldviews, the father is transcendent, the father is distant, the mother is immanent. The first thing that happens to a child, onto the breast. It's not to the father, it's to the mother. The nearness that the child experiences in the world is the mother, and the father is distant. The father is watching the act from it. The word, the mother, the word for rahmah in Arabic. So if we say mother here, the word in Arabic for mother, for womb, is rahim, which in Hebrew, rahim. They have the same idea. Jews have the same idea. Rahim is the same root word for rahmah, that it is through the womb that rahmah comes into the world. Without the womb, there is no sense of rahmah. And the womb is seen as one of the greatest rahmahs, because one, it is a rahmah in that this helpless creature is protected in the womb by a caring, loving individual that does not want harm to come to that which is growing in her and being nurtured because of her mercy. The idea of the mother, the compassion, right? It's the idea of compassion, that the mother is forgiving. The father, it's more difficult. And how many scenarios do we know in the human condition? How many scenarios do we know where the father throws the child out and the mother lets the child in the back door? I mean, this is very common in human conditions, right? The father, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. That's it. But the mother can't. And I know a friend of mine who was Jewish. He became Muslim, and they had a funeral for him after he became his family. And he was still alive, but they considered like that he died. But his mother used to send him cookies on his birthday, right? So the idea that the mother, even though this person has done something so severe in our tradition as that we cut him off, the mother doesn't cut them off. It's very difficult by nature. And this relates to the womb. The womb is empty. There's room in the womb for forgiveness. Right? There's room there for forgiveness. Look at the womb. By its nature, the womb is a very small room in the midst of woman, and yet it can expand to take in so much. It has this flexibility, and it bleeds. Right? It bleeds. The womb bleeds. It renews itself. And these are very powerful metaphors and images for this idea of immanence. if we look in terms of nearness and distance, how this relates to human beings, nearness is related to gratitude. Distance is related to ingratitude. Nearness is related to iman. Distance is related to kufr. So if a person accepts God and wants and strives to come to know God, that is a drawing near process. This is where we differ from the angels. The Quran says there is no angel except that he has a fixed place. The angels are fixed. It's not an upwardly mobile job. They are fixed. The cherubim, muqarrabun, are the nearest. And then, and also the great angels, Jibra'il, Israfil, Serafiel, Mikael. These are the close angels in the angelic realm. But they are fixed. They don't disobey God. They only obey God out of jabr, compulsion. The human being has this interesting aspect to him or her. And that is, the human being can choose one of two things. This is where we begin our journey. The Quran talks about two phenomena. One is called darajat, which are upwardly. Darajat means stairs moving up, Jacob's ladder. Darakat are stairs moving down. Darakat are easy. Darajat are hard. And the difference between them is the jim letter and the ka letter. The jim letter in the Arabic science of the letters is a shidda letter. It's a hard letter. The ka doesn't have the same shidda, doesn't have the same hardness. An individual at this point, as a child, it is born according to the Muslims in what's called the fitra nature, which is submission. The very first state of the child before the nafs begins to develop, and I'm going to explain the nafs. The very first state of the human being is submission. There is a famous teacher from Morocco. One of his students asked him, how do we come to God? How do we arrive to God? He went upstairs and he came down with a newborn. And he said, until you're like this, you don't arrive to God. Right? Until you're like this, you don't arrive to God. The idea is until you are helpless before God. Until you recognize what your human attributes are in relation to the divine attributes. Because we are godlike. You see, the human being is godlike. You know, Shakespeare's idea of the paragon of animals. Right? How like a god, this human being. This form, the symmetry, the will, the volition, the power, the sense of independence, the ability to transform, the creative capacity within the human being. The human being is godlike. But this is delusional because he is only godlike in relation to creation. When the human being relates himself to the Creator, he becomes the most pathetic of creatures. He becomes the most helpless of creatures, the most incapacitated. We can't survive for a few minutes without air. There was once a Buddhist monk he was a master, had his student, came to him and he said, I want to achieve enlightenment. He said, the first thing you have to do is learn how to breathe. He said, well, I know how to do that. I've been breathing all my life. He said, no, you have to learn how to be conscious of your breath. He said, why should I learn how to be conscious of my breath? So he had some of his students take him to a river next to the monastery and hold him under. and then brought him up. And he said, now do you know why? In other words, we forget how quickly we can lose our breath, how quickly we can become helpless, because we feel this sense of independence. And until we start becoming aware of our weaknesses, our inherent weaknesses, the most subtle is breath itself, because we are one breath away from death. Literally one breath away from death. So the fitra nature is that a child is in submission to God. As the nafs begins to develop, the first nafs that shows up, and nafs here is a very important word in the Islamic tradition. And I'll just go through a little bit in the semantic field of nafs. The root word is again nafasa. You have it in Hebrew also, nefesh. Nefesh is breath or spirit. And also, interestingly enough, psyche in Greek, same meaning, spirit, nefesh, to breathe. It's related to breath, right? Nefes has two, at its base root, it has two meanings. Nefisa and nefusa. All you do is change a voweling. One of them means to be precious, and the other means to be niggardly. So right there, in the Arabic language, there is a concept embedded in the idea of self. That we have two aspects to our nature. One is the bestial, and the other is the angelic. One is the selfless, and the other is the niggardly. One is the one that wants to give, and the other is the one that wants to hold on. And this is the human dichotomy. At the next level, if you go to the next root, which is nefasa, where you put a shadda over it, so it would look like this. Same root though. Nefasa means to help somebody, to relieve them of their constriction. In other words, to give them breath. To help them. To expand somebody who's constricted. But you go to the next root. Nafasa. And it means to undermine somebody else, to compete against them. So it's right there in the language. The human being has these two opposing qualities. For the child, at the first level, you can see this already. One is that the child will smile and give, the mother melts the heart, right? I mean, you watch people's faces when they're looking at the baby and and when the baby smiles, they all get, like they start kind of melting. Right? Why? Because it's like a gift from that baby. But then it starts screaming, I want. So right there in the baby, we begin to see the emergence of the dual nature. And we see it through childhood. I mean, I have a 5 and a 3-year-old, and you can see them moving between these two states. This amazing state of wanting to give, wanting to share, and then this other state of wanting to hold on, I'm not going to share. Right? Negation, affirmation. The world is negation, the next world is affirmation. Negating the world, affirming God. This is the human being. We are negators and affirmers, but if we get it wrong, what we should be negating and affirming, we go into trouble. So the first nafs is called nafs al-amara. And there's an interesting book by Robert Bly, for people that like him. Some people can't stand him, but I like him. There's a book he wrote called The Sibling Society, which is about modern America. Because he's got this idea that Americans are turning into big babies, right? That they've lost this kind of sense of moving into maturity. And he uses the Islamic model of saying that many of us have become this nafs al-amara. Amara means the commanding self. It is the self that is commanding us to do things that we shouldn't do. And if we submit to that self, we become a slave of our passions. And this in the Arabic language is called abd. The Prophet said, wretched is the slave of the dinar and the dirham, of gold and silver. Wretched is the slave of his clothes. Wretched is the slave of his riding beast. People that become slaves of stuff, of the world. So nafs al-amara is the commanding self. Now the next move up is called nafs al-lawwama. This is the blaming self, the reproachful self. The self is moving out of its abject nature. And it's beginning to recognize a type of moral imperative. The nafs is still doing wrong, but it's saying, I shouldn't be doing this. And this is consciousness. This is moving out of a completely bestial state and into a state now where there is a tension between the bestial and the angelic nature of the human being. And this is best related to the idea of Adam alayhi salam being created from earth and water. Water is a purifying element by its nature. Water in many traditions is related to consciousness. If you go into the Chinese tradition, water is related to consciousness. The element of water itself. Earth is density. Now, water allows light through. Light can penetrate water, but light does not penetrate earth. So the human being is mixed with these two admixtures of earth and water. That we have one aspect of ourselves does not want to let the light through and another does. And this is where you go into the nafs al-lawwama. Earth is density. Now, water allows light through. Light can penetrate water, but light does not penetrate earth. So the human being is mixed with these two admixtures of earth and water. That we have one aspect of ourselves does not want to let the light through and another does. And this is where you go into the nafs al-lawwama. The reproachful self. You shouldn't have done that. Right? And this is, I mean, some people have, modern people have put this into the idea of the id and the ego, and then the superego. You know, the id is more like the nafs al-ammara, the compulsive self. And then the final self is called nafs al-mutma'inna. Which is the self at peace. This is the self that's submitted. This is the self that has submitted completely its being to God. And this self is no longer in this conflict. This is no longer in the religious state of I should do that or I ought to do that. But now it is moved into Kierkegaard's kind of ethical self. It now realizes that this is the right thing and it wants to do it. It wants to do the right thing. And it does the right thing now by nature, not by compulsion, not by feeling I have to do this thing. So the human being has two choices: to submit to the low self and take himself into alienation, which is wrath, which is transcendence. To literally place himself in a relationship to God in which God is absolutely other, disconnected from God completely. And this is epitomized by the idea of Jahannam, the idea of hell. That this is the ultimate alienation. Now, fire is a very interesting element because it can't rise above its nature. It has an upward motion, but it can't rise above because it's bound to the earth. You see, the fire only exists because of earth. And yet it has this upward motion. It wants to, it's moving up, but it's held down by, and this is the idea of being pulled down. You see, being pulled down by fire. And fire is very similar to light. It's not light, but it's very similar to the concept of light. I mean, there is light in fire, but it's not the light that we relate to the spiritual light, luminosity. The other is an upward movement. Now, there is a tradition that the Prophet Muhammad said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the fire is surrounded by desirable things. And paradise is surrounded by undesirable things. The idea here is, If we look at the pure outwardness of something and not at its inwardness, and we submit to the outwardness, that an outward thing can look very desirable, but what are its inward realities? So for instance, for a man who submits to his lusts, which is very common, one of the 7 deadly sins, and very common human experience. There is something desirable, obviously, for a male and a female to have a sexual relation. At the physical level, it can be very physically stimulating experience. But if we look at it outside of its social context, that desirability might be there. If we begin to place it within a societal context, what are the implications of this act? What are the implications of my sleeping with another person without any social responsibility? Because one pregnancy often can result. So there's an other, there's a third. There's a third that is the result of the act. Also, what is it saying about intimacy in a culture in which the most intimate physical act becomes profane to the degree that it has no emotional content? In other words, there are deep implications to the act itself. If we look at it from its desirability, it's a downward motion. If we look at the aspects that might be less desirable, such as commitment. Commitment is a difficult thing, to make a commitment. There are things that are going to be difficult to relate to it. But what is the inward reality? So outwardly, there are many people in this culture who do not want to commit to marriage because it's undesirable for them. They want to be free. I'm upwardly mobile. I don't want to be tied down. I mean, they see it, tied down. That's undesirable. Footloose and fancy-free. That's how I want to be. What are the long-term effects of that? You see, what are the long-term effects? So outwardly, there are many desirable things. But then inwardly, there are many undesirable things. Just as outwardly, there are many undesirable things, but inwardly, there are many desirable things. So what the Quran, in a sense, really is trying to do is to get people to think deeply about things. And this is why it constantly talks about thinking about the aqibah. What is the long term? What is the subsequent results of the action? So this is in a sense, is a model of human potentiality in terms of its upward movement, and also degradation in terms of its downward movement. Most people are in conflict. Many people are not in conflict. They have submitted completely to this downward motion, and other people are struggling to move up. And some people are moving up. Now, in the modern world, we've become, I think, quite cynical in a lot of ways, but I think the ancients probably had, it was just that there was a, a sense of this. Even within our Western culture, there was a strong sense of the idea of this upward movement, that it was humanly possible. The dark night of the soul, St. John of the Cross's type of idea that one could really achieve a type of power over the self and have completion and fulfillment in God. I think the difference maybe between that classical model in the Western world and the Islamic model would really probably relate to the idea that the Muslim model is not saying the world is bad. And the reason is because there's something, the world is seen as literally a theater of divine revelation. And the fact that God has made it a revelation means that it can't be bad. But to the degree that God is absent from the world is bad. So in other words, there's two hadiths of the Prophet. One said, the world is green and beautiful, and another one he said, it's like a dead carcass. It's green and beautiful for the one who understands one's place in the world and honors that place and rises up to stewardship and attempts to subdue the self and to be a caretaker. It is a carcass for the one who destroys his soul in the world and thus destroys the world as well. So the next thing move is the idea of what's called the belief in Allah, the belief in the books, in the angels, the books, and in the messengers. And then, I mean, I really didn't cover too much the angels, but the angels are basically beings made of pure light, created light, not uncreated divine light, but created light. And there's a belief in the angels that there are angels with us wherever we are. The Muslims believe that there are 2 angels with us right now, each one of us. Whether you're Muslim or not, you have 2 angels assigned to you. One is called Raqib. And one of the things that the Muslim in the prayer, you say, Assalamu alaikum, you're greeting the angels. So this is a type of becoming conscious of the angelic presence. Part of the gift of that is to feel shy before the angels. Because the angels, the dominant function of these 2 angels is recording actions. According to the Muslim tradition, the angel of the right records good actions. The angel of the left records bad actions. Now, according to the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, if a person does a bad action, the angel of the right does not write it down. It waits. And if the person asks forgiveness before the end of the day for that wrong action, it does not write it down. But if they do not, it writes it down. The angel of the right immediately writes down a good action. And there are even actions that are based on intention. So the angel of the right, and this is the idea that God's mercy is over God's wrath, that it takes precedence over the wrath of God. There are also angels that have the functions of maintaining order. Now, I think in the West we have an idea of angels because of pictures. And so when we think of angels, we start thinking of females or males with wings and things like this. And although the angels are described as having wings, from the Muslim point of view, there's not an anthropomorphic type of, we do not project onto the angels. They have neither sex. They're not male or female, according to the Islamic tradition. So, and they do what they're told. They can't disobey God. And they're made of pure light. Now, the next thing that the Muslims are told to believe in, so the first is Allah. Second is the angels. Now, angel also, according to the Quran, they're called messengers, which is the Greek meaning of angelos, is messenger. They're messengers of God. And then the books, and those relate to primarily to the Torah, Psalms, Gospel in singular, and the Quran. And then, if there were other books, like Muslims would tend to hold out. You know, if like the Dhammapada scripture of the Buddhists or something, they just say Allahu Alam. God knows, I don't know. Better not to negate it because we don't know. And then the next is the messengers themselves. And there are 2 qualities here. One is the prophets, and the other is the messengers. Prophets one tradition says 124,000, another tradition says 224,000. Muslims tend to say Allahu Alam. We know that there was a lot of them. The Quran says some of them we told you about, others we didn't tell you about. So the idea is that Allahu Alam. But the Quran does say every peoples were given a prophet. And they were sent with the tongue of the people. It is the Muslim belief that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the only universal prophet. That all of the other prophets, including Jesus, were tribal or to peoples. They were not sent as a global prophet. That the Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was the only global messenger. And that is very strong in the Muslim belief. The prophets are given news from God. It can apply simply to themselves, or they can convey it to others. If they convey it with new addendums to a previous dispensation, then they're called messengers. In other words, if they're given some new things, if they alter the law. Like Jesus would be seen as a messenger, whereas Isaac would be seen as a prophet. Abraham is a messenger. Muhammad is a messenger. The basic rule is every messenger is a prophet, but not every prophet is a messenger. So there's a distinction between the two. And then the fifth article of faith is what's called the qadr. And this is where we get into debates, and people can go on and on. This is an unsolvable problem, but I'll just give you an idea of how the Muslims traditionally have dealt with this. Qadr is, in most books, called predestination. The actual root word means a measuring out. A measuring out. Many verses in the Quran indicate that God has measured out everything. Everything has what it needs. Everything will fulfill its quality and characteristic. From the Muslim point of view, it is the qadr of Allah, the design of the human being. We have been measured, our symmetry, how the human being emerges. It is the qadr of Allah, how the lion appears. All of these things are measured out. What is also measured out is one's provision in the world. Every human being has an appointed amount of provision. Now it's interestingly that the Muslims generally say provision is not what you possess, but what you will use. So for instance, Bill Gates, who is a multi-billionaire, his provision is only that which he will use. So if he has a house with 100 rooms and he only uses 3 of them, that's what has been allotted to him. The other rooms are not part of his provision. Provision is related to what you will use. And that has been predetermined. Now, the obvious question that comes to people is, if things are predetermined, then where does will come into this? Where does the human being have will? From the Muslim perspective, the first thing that is understood here is that had there not been an element of will here, then there would be no meaning to punishment and reward. It would be unfair and this is why a child is not punished, right? Because the child does not have free will in the sense that it does not have a full understanding of its own capacities, its volition, its ability to do harm. A child does not understand that, whereas an adult does. The qadr then in relation to free will is that every human being will choose what they do in the action is the intention. So my intention in any action is what I earn. We are not judged according to the action alone. We are judged according to the intention within the heart related to the action. This is what the human being is judged upon. And the Prophet Muhammad in the first hadith in there said, إِنَّمَا الْعَمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are by intentions. Now the other thing is that the Muslims say is that no one has a sense that they're determined. There are obviously elements within our nature and our being that have a determination. I did not decide what color my skin was. I did not decide who my parents were. I did not decide where I would be raised and what language I would be given. There are definitely elements that we have no choice, and these are called wahbi. But then there are elements that we have choice, which is called kasbi, which is related to acquisition. And this is what we are taken into account for. Now in terms of good and evil, there is a belief here in the qadr and in the hadith in good and evil that Jeff brought up. Because we had talked about this yesterday, and that was about intentions. When I said that actions that you're judged by your intentions, that means an intention related to an action. In other words, what merely occurs to the heart. If it's evil, you're not taken into account for it. But if it's good, you're given a reward for it. So if a person has a good intention, but they don't act it out, there is a reward related to that. Whereas with evil, it's not. Like somebody cuts you off on the road and you know, I'd like to kill that person or something like that. As long as you don't go and do it, you're not taken into account for that. And unfortunately, people have recently started doing stuff like that. But now, just to relate to the qadar, this is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in the Islamic tradition. I think a lot of Muslims even misunderstand it. But let me relate it to two very important concepts in the Quran. Generally, khayr is understood to be good, and shar is understood to be evil. But from the Islamic cosmological view, this is related to abundance, and this is related to want. And the actual moral component in these concepts is played down in a way that it wouldn't be in Christianity. So let me give you an example. I think for a lot of people, they have a hard time with the idea of a God who could create evil. And this is a classic philosophical problem in the West. If God is all good and He's all powerful, then there shouldn't be evil. Because if He was all good, He wouldn't want evil. And if He was all powerful, He could do something about it. And this is a common philosophical problem. They call it the problem of evil. And there have been attempts to resolve it, but from a Muslim point of view, we believe that good and evil are both from God. But before we say, you know, what, you mean God is evil, let's look a little deeper at what this means in terms of its philosophical implications. The word shar is related to, for instance, poverty. Poverty in the Arab tradition is shar. Why? Because it's a want. There's no moral judgment there in a poor person. You're not saying a poor person's evil. You're just saying poverty is shar. It's a want. There's a lack of something. When we talk about good and evil, from a Muslim perspective, good means that there is a divine presence. Shar means there's an absence of the divine. When you look at this in terms of a moral action, if a person saves somebody drowning, that would be called khayr. But if a person kills somebody, that would be called shar. Why? Because if you save the drowning person, there is a quality, there is a divine quality that is embodied there, which is rahmah. But if you kill a person unjustly, there is the absence of the divine quality, which is justice. You have been unjust. And the Quran says that God is not unjust. So in the absence of good, we have evil. And this is how the Muslims view it. They literally view evil as an absence of good. So to the degree that the divine qualities are not present in the world, we have evil. And to the degree that the divine qualities are present in the world, the immanence is present there, we have good. And this is why there is a hadith that says, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allahumma al-khayru bayna yadayk. Oh Allah, good is in your presence. وَالشَّرُّ لَا يَعُودُ إِلَيْكَ. And evil never returns to you. So while we believe that God has created a world of opposites, abundance, want, good, evil, we do not believe that evil goes back to God. Because evil is the absence of the divine. In other words, the divine is absent from the act. Now the other problem, when we look in terms of khayr and shar, is the Quran says, عَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Maybe you detest a thing and it is khayr for you, it's good for you. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. And maybe you love a thing, but it's evil for you. And then it says, Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. And God knows and you do not know. So there's an idea here in this concept of good and evil that we are in a relative situation. We do not have all of the information here. That one person's evil is another person's good. One person's evil is another person's good. And this happens all over. You can see this. Somebody loses a job, another person gets the job. So for one person it was shar. For another person it was good. And this is the nature of the world. Now if you look in terms of the giver of life and the taker of life, if there was no taking of life, then there couldn't be a continuation of life. This is the nature. We generally relate the taking of life to shar. It's a want, it's a lack of. But in relation to the next world, there is a khayr, right? Because death in this world means life in the next world. So this is related to, we are not putting moral components here, we are not judging things for ourselves. Now the Quran has given for the Muslims a criterion. It is evil to kill another person unjustly, and a person is taken into account for that and killed. In relation to the big picture, we do not know and we can't make an eternal judgment. We can only make a temporal judgment. We do not know. In other words, if somebody murders another person, and by all outward appearances it was an unjustly murder, that person is taken into account and his life is forfeited, or in certain circumstances, what are called the wulat ad-dam can forgive him. Islam has an interesting attitude towards the Muslims allow for a family to forgive the person. So you can't, the Christian ideal of forgiving, and the Quran actually says to forgive is higher. So if a person killed another person, the family has the right to say they forgive them. Right? They can do that. But in terms of highway robbery, brigandry, there's no... That's anybody that threatens the security of a society, in other words, indiscriminate. So if there was a fight between two people and one person killed the other person, then the family could say, we don't want to take him to account for it. We're going to forgive him. They can do that. But if it's somebody who goes in and robs a store and kills somebody, then they forfeited their life by Islamic law.
Explain the concept of fatwa.
A fatwa? Like Salman Rushdie?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, a fatwa is not a death. A fatwa is not a death penalty. It's a legal opinion. It's not binding either. In other words, technically by Islamic law, a person can give a legal opinion. Like I can give an opinion. You can come to me if I'm a faqih, a jurisprudent. You say, what's the punishment for somebody that curses the Prophet Muhammad? And you say, death. Right? So then I say, well, Salman Rushdie cursed him. Well, although that book is, what do they call it in literature? Romana Clef? Is that what it is? Who's the... Romana Clef, is that what they call it? Yeah. Is that what they call it? Does anyone know the literary term? There's a term for something where you hide a historical or a factual thing within a literary... I think it's Romana Clef, I'm not sure though. Anyway, you know, somebody can say, well, he slandered the Prophet Muhammad. Salman Rushdie would say, look, this is a piece of fiction. By Islamic law, that was completely unacceptable. In other words, you have to take people to trial. You can't just kill somebody. You know, Muslims we're not vigilantes. There's actually a procedure. And apostasy has, what's that?
I said you have a difference with the Rushdie was clearly an example of the difference between the sacred and the profane.
That's one way of looking at it, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the modern West, I think Norman Mailer actually during that time said, you know, heresy has made us free, long live heresy. In other words, there are a lot of people in the West that see heresy as a good thing. And it's interesting, this gets to this whole idea, because heresy in Greek, heretikos, means to choose for yourself. It's what they call the middle voice in Greek, the verb. heren, which is to choose for oneself. So I choose my own way. I'm not going to choose, the way religion tells me or the way God tells me or the way. I choose my own way. And that is the original meaning of a heretic. Somebody who chose their own way, who did not submit to. And in the West, we certainly have a tradition now, a post-Enlightenment tradition, which is really, we don't have to be subservient and submissive to a church or to some doctrinal authority, some dogma. That the individuals have a right to choose what they believe, to choose how they want to worship, or how they don't want to worship, right? So that's very strong, I think, in modern Western tradition. And a lot of it is a reaction to the abuses of the church during the Middle Ages and the burning of heretics and things like that. There was a lot of that went on. Now, in the Islamic tradition, traditionally, heresy, there are laws of apostasy. I think they're a lot more difficult to prove, but there is a procedure. You cannot simply condemn somebody as a heretic in Islamic law. They have to be brought to trial. The intention has to be looked at. Do you see? So, but that's a case where, politics is being used within a religious context. I really... Oh, very much so. Yeah, because the Egyptians had a whole different reaction to it. Like the Azhar, they had a different reaction. So, here was a case where... Because, I'll tell you something about Muslims. Muslims take the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ very seriously. They really do. And it's interesting that the Iranians also condemned the Greek author who wrote the Last Temptation of Christ. They also condemned him as disparaging a prophet, but that didn't make news. Do you see what I mean? So they were just across the board. You make fun of prophets, you're asking for trouble from us. That was their idea. Now that was true. There's still laws on the books in England, apostasy laws. There are laws in England, but they did not relate to the Islamic religion, right? They relate to the Christian religion. So technically there are still in certain countries, there are laws against, like in Greece and other places, there are laws against making fun of prophets, disparaging prophets, things like that. So a fatwa is just a legal opinion, and it's non-binding. It is non-binding.
Killed Rushdie. Is it justifiable? I mean, he seems to fear for his life.
If Rushdie was in a Muslim country and he did disparage the Prophet, that by Islamic law, if he is tried and found to be guilty, that the punishment is death. That is a punishment for any prophet, Abraham, Moses, any of the prophets, not just the Prophet Muhammad.
He just has to stay out of Muslim country, he's okay?
No, I don't think so. Because I think the Iranians have, they offered a reward and things like that. So I think, he does fear for his life. Personally, I'm not going to go out and hunt down Rushdie and things like that. It's not my business. My understanding of Islamic law is that it's not a vigilante law. I can't take the law in my own hands. Because that leads to anarchy. Think about this societally. If I'm with some guy in private, and for some reason I steal all his money, blow him away, and then I tell the judge, well, he cursed the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Good alibi, right? If you start thinking about it, it's crazy. You can't just, I'll give you an example. In Islamic law, if a man finds his wife in bed with another man, he cannot kill her? Absolutely not. He has to have 4 witnesses that see penetration. Pretty impossible, right? And I think you have to be pretty perverse to, go into a room and try to, see that. If people are under covers, you can't do it not just on top of one another. Seriously. And if the only thing he has recourse to is if he does find that, immediately he has to do what's called mula'na, which is where he goes to a qadi, he says, I found my wife in bed, and then the wife is brought, and they do what's called mula'na, which is a mutual cursing. Each one swears that the other is lying, and on the 5th time they call the curse of Allah on them. If she does that, then she is absolved, but there's a permanent divorce, and the child does not go to his lineage. The child is not considered his child, right? If she doesn't, then she would be guilty of adultery. No, because it's related to lineage. That's the only reason. It's related to lineage. In other words, Islam is a patrilineal teaching. So it's one of the 5 things, and I didn't go into this, but it's very interesting. The 5 things that the Sharia is believed to preserve. The first is religion. The second is life. The third is lineage. The fourth is wealth. And the fifth is name, honor.
The Sharia law.
Law. So Muslims believe that these are the 5 things. Every rule in Islam can be related to one of these 5 things. So the reason prayer is prescribed, preservation of religion. The reason, the prohibition for fornication, preservation of lineage. It is a right of a child to know who their father and mother are. That is a right. So fornication is prohibited. So in that type situation, the best thing, you're supposed to veil people, right? If a woman accuses the husband of adultery, that does not relate to her lineage. She can ask for a divorce, perfectly permissible. She can go to a qadi and say, I have ground for divorce. And she can call herself what's called mutadarrira, and she can say, I want out of this marriage. She is not supposed to say why. You see, the reason a woman is because of the lineage. If in other words, from the adultery, if there's a child as a result of the adultery, then it would be attributed to a man who doesn't. It is not the child of that man, and that is preservation of lineage. So the Sharia says that the man says, no, that is definitely not my child. And he has to do it right away. He can't wait like 6 months later and say, oh, I don't, that's not my child. No, he has to do it right from the start, or else it doesn't stand up in court.
But if he wasn't the adulterer,
then she has grounds for a divorce, but she does not accuse him.
Why not?
Because it's related to lineage. In other words, accusing somebody of adultery is one of the worst things you can do in Islam. It really is. But the only reason that there is a situation where the man can do it is related to lineage, because there is inheritance. A child inherits from the man. And also the child takes the man's name. If it is not his child, then he does not want that child to have his lineage nor his name if he knows that the child's not from his seed. And that's the only time. And if she denies that, she is not condemned for adultery. But the child does not go to the lineage. She's not punished for adultery if she denies it. Do you see?
Is this on Quranic teaching or on...
Yes, no, it's Quranic teaching. Mula'na. So the idea is simply lineage. It's not, you're not making a moral... Do you see what I mean? The woman is not taken into account for something if she denies it. Her denial stands up in court. But the marriage is she's separated from the man, and the child does not go to the man.
adoption?
There's no adoption in Islam. There's what's called wakala, which is where you take care of a child, which is highly encouraged. But the child never takes the name, ever. It's prohibited. And this is because one of the things the Sharia came to do was preserve lineage. The people should know where they come from. And this is why women, it is prohibited for them to change their names in Islam. A woman does not take the name of her husband, because it changes lineage.
Why is lineage so important?
Because it relates to, within any culture, you have honor that relates to lineage. A bastard in Islam is not the same as a child born in wedlock.
Should the honor supersede lineage? I mean, shouldn't there be a respect for life and neighbors?
Well, life is why a child is not aborted, even if it's a bastard child. Life is over lineage.
He bears the stigma.
He doesn't bear a stigma. It's not on the child, it's on the parents. The child, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. No child bears the wrong actions of the parents, and that's why the child is not aborted.
But it is a moral stigma for the wife.
If it was born out of wedlock, definitely. She goes under the category of zaniya, which is a fornicator. Definitely.
And the child itself is something the mother side.
There's definitely stigma within culture. By the Sharia, the child is not supposed to suffer for it. But there's definitely a human failing here. You do have stigma related to it in Muslim cultures, but there's not supposed to be.
Is there a punishment for adultery, like stoning?
If the person is, if there are 4 witnesses witnessing penetration, and they have to be just witnesses, they have to be people recognized as upright in the community. It's impossible, I guarantee you. No, then she's punished. And there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad that a woman during his time came to her and confessed to her. And he turned away. And then she came here, she turned away. Till she confessed 4 times. And then he said, "Are you with child?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "Go have your child." She came back after a year, gave birth to the child. She came back and she said, "Tahirni, purify me." And then he said, "Go nurse your child." She went 2 years. She came back. And then she said, "Purify me." Because there's an idea in Islam, if you do a grave wrong action, not a minor wrong action, if you do a grave wrong action and you have the had punishment in this world, you're not punished for it in the next world. So what she was saying is, I don't want to take chances of being, whether Allah forgives me or not, I want to be certain that I don't have this in the next world. She said, "Purify me." The woman was stoned, and one of the companions said, "May Allah curse her." And the Prophet said, "Don't say that, because if her blood was spread over this city, there wouldn't be a wrong action remaining in this city." Her tawbah, her repentance was so great. He was saying that her repentance was so great that this entire city would be forgiven had they gotten a portion of her repentance. Now there's another thing, if a person leaves the pit, then there's no stoning. For a person who confessed, if they leave the pit, then you have to cease stoning. Stoning, I guarantee you, it's very rare in the Islamic history. Very few cases, really. It's
What do you mean, leave the pit? If they're able to get out?
no. If they get out during the process, you have to stop. In other words, a person can say, "No, I changed my mind," at any time.
And our bullet has been taken as a substitute for stoning.
No. That's unacceptable by Sharia. Yeah.
Those stonings happen in Saudi Arabia.
You know, this is a gross, to me, this is a gross breach of Islamic law, what takes place there.
Okay, so it does happen.
They do implement that, but it's a gross breach of, I mean, Sharia, you can't just apply piecemeal Sharia. It's a total system, and within a healthy Islamic culture, those things are very rare. For instance, in Islamic law, you don't go alone with a foreign woman. You don't. It's one of the things that is a condition within the society. It's part of the social contract. You do not, like, I would not be alone with a woman who is not either a direct relative or my wife. I would not go alone with her. It's prohibited for me in Islamic law. And vice versa, it's prohibited for a woman.
So you're saying, what about, when you say go alone?
It means I cannot be in a room alone.
You're traveling on a plane.
That's not alone. You're in a company.
Would you give someone a ride? You need a ride car from the actor.
No, you're not supposed to be alone with a woman. Absolutely not. And a woman is not supposed to be alone with a man. And this relates to protection of honor, so that you are not accused. Because what happens often is your intentions might be perfectly good, but somebody sees you coming out of a room with somebody, and big problem. And I'll tell you something, in our culture, this is a major problem. Sexual harassment, these type of things. If there are witnesses, you don't have the problem. When there are people when it's 2 people alone together, it's his word against hers. Right? I believe, what was her name? Anita. I believe Anita. You get the society split. Democrats believe Anita and Republicans believe, what was the other guy? And then the thing about it is the man's honor is tainted. Now, I'm not saying I tend to probably incline to believing Anita, but the point is maybe she wasn't telling the truth. Maybe she was paid by by the Democrats to disparage. I mean, I'm just saying these are possibilities, right? In that case, here's a man whose honor is destroyed. Or here's a man who for the rest of his life people are going to scratch their head. Did he or didn't he? Do you see? So the idea of preserving people's honor is very strong in Islam. That a person has a right, it is a fundamental human right. It's a divinely given right that you have your honor intact. And you do everything you can to preserve that honor. One, you don't lie. You don't steal. You don't cheat. These are all things that disparage your honor. And you become known for it. Which is one of the reasons why in Islamic law, if you see somebody do something wrong, you are told to veil their faults. Because if you expose people in a society, then the impetus for guarding their honor or for making tawbah or repentance is diminished. In other words, if I become known for lying, then people, even if I start telling the truth, people are going to still remember, oh, you know, that's the liar. So it lessens the power of the ability of a person to do that and diminishes the impetus. So, and then wealth, preservation of wealth, why there's no stealing, things like that. So these are the 5 things. Now, that was just a digression because somebody asked a question, but...
Can we ask one more question? If a child is not adopted, but just taken care of, then they have no inheritance? Is that how the law works?
They don't inherit. Good point. Okay. Yeah. An adopted child does not inherit.
So what do they do?
What do you mean?
How do they make their way?
Well, you're supposed to raise them and give them a job, you know, teach them how to provide for them. I mean, did you get an inheritance? A lot of people don't get inheritance. You know what I mean? The lawyers ate up ours. Because my family kind of got into a fight and ended up, you know, which happens. That's why it's nice in Islamic law. It's all portioned out. You can't fight over it. It's fixed.
Dies, does the wife get all the inheritance?
The wife inherits it. She's one of the inheritors. It's related. I mean, inheritance laws are related to the Qur'an directly. The Qur'an determines what portions people get. And the wife does inherit from the husband, yes.
All of his wealth.
Not all of it, no. The children have portions as well. The man can give 1/3 of his wealth to whoever he wants. The other 2/3 are determined by the Qur'an.
So he could get that 1/3. It's up to
And it's interesting that a man cannot divorce his wife on his deathbed. If a man has an illness that is called marad makhuf, like cancer, where the terminality is probable, it is prohibited for him to divorce his wife as a way of kind of getting her out of the inheritance or something, spiting her. It's prohibited. No, Islam is very strict about inheritance. And one of the things, if you look traditionally, Hodgson points this out in The Venture of Islam, that Islam actually breaks down monopoly. The inheritance laws are designed so that wealth is not accumulated into one small individual. Like in the 19th century, I want to think about, you know, if you read Jane Austen's novels, I mean, that is a real theme in her novels, the injustice of women being completely disinherited in 19th century England. I mean, remember, this is the age of the Enlightenment. And here's women in 19th century England being thrown out of their houses because there was not a male heir to take care of them. They lost all their money or it went to somebody, the male. Right? This happened very recent in Western civilization. In Islam, the woman has a right to her husband and her father's wealth. She gets a portion of her father's wealth as well. And this is one of the ways that women became wealthy in Islam. There are historically many women who had... Hani is a wonderful example. She's in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Islam. There's a little section on Hani, who she married a husband, and she actually owned a factory. And then the husband claimed that it was his, like community property or something. And it did not hold up in court, according to Ibn Hajar. The judge said, no, it's her property. So, and that was, 13th century. So, I mean, that's a whole other thing. We're actually on Iman, because that's really related to Sharia. And what I'll do, inshallah, is when we do the section on the last hadith, I'll open it up to talking about some things about Sharia. Because I think Sharia is definitely one of the areas where there's a lot of misunderstandings, misconceptions in this culture. People see it as very primitive law. And so, I can talk about that and open it up to things. And another thing about the Islamic law is that there are many different opinions. in the law. That the actual things that are clearly, there's no debate about, are not that many. Many of the situations there is an allowance for the intellect to understand and interpret the tradition. But if we go back to this idea, khair and shar, human beings are taken into account for the good they do and the evil they do. The Quran says, لَهَا مَا كَسَبَتْ, for the soul is the good that it earned, وَعَلَيْهَا مَا اكْتَسَبَتْ, and against the soul is the evil that it has acquired. So we are taken into account for good and evil that we do in the world. The Muslims, the Quran is emphasizing the doing of good actions. Now, one of the words that it uses for this is hasanat. And the opposite is sayyat. Hasanat, the root word is beauty. In other words, there's an idea that a good action is a congruous action. It is a harmonic action. That a bad action is aesthetically unpleasing. It is cacophonic. It is ugly. That the human being by nature recognizes beauty and recognizes good. And this is the idea in the Quran. It says, وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ, we guided the human being to the two roads of good and evil. That there is something inherent within the human being. Now if you look at this in terms of the animal kingdom, when animals do something, we do not put moral judgment on it. If a snake bites and kills a child, we do not say it's an evil snake. I mean, people might do that metaphorically, you know, but they don't, there's not a moral component there. It's simply being itself. And there's a Rumi tells a story about the turtle and the scorpion and the frog. Right there at the side of the river. And the scorpion asked the frog, give me a ride across the river so I don't have to walk around. Or across the lake. The frog says, I'm not stupid. If I give you a ride, you'll sting me. And the scorpion says, you know, that's ridiculous. Think about this. If I sting you, we'll both sink and drown. So the frog says, that makes sense. Takes him across. Halfway across, the scorpion stings the frog. The frog says, why'd you do that? He says, my nature. Right? So the idea then is that there is within the animal world natures that they cannot change. If a lion is hungry and it sees you, it sees lunch. It does not see you as, I'm going to do something really evil today. I'm going to go eat this poor person. It's just fulfilling its nature. When a human being eats another human being, right? Like that guy Dower, or whatever his name was. Yeah, Dahmer. There's something we say that is sick. Why? What is the difference between the lion eating the human being and this guy eating the human being? The moral component. We say he should know better. That's a breach of the social contract. The person has gone out of its boundaries. And this is very important because in the Quran there is an idea of hudud, of boundaries, and that the human being is morally bound to stay within the boundaries and not transgress them. And the word in Arabic for an evildoer is fasiq, which comes from a root word when the seed splits and it comes out of the shell. So the fasiq, the evildoer, is the one that splits the protective boundaries of the hudud. Now these are seen, the hudud of Allah, which are the sharia, the sacred law. These are seen as not simply arbitrary laws. Don't do this, don't do that. They are protective laws from the Muslim perspective. These are laws designed to maintain integrity within the society. When the Quran says, "La taqrabu zina," do not go near fornication. Why? It says, because it's a fahisha, it's a perversion, wasa'a sabila, and it leads down a terrible road. So the idea is that, look, this is not simply an arbitrary law. There are consequences that are related to this transgression that will have wretched effects in your culture and in your civilization. become very jaded in their experiences. There's a need for continual and more extreme stimulation. It relates to I think a lot of it relates to the stimulation that people have with television. Murders, violence, sexual stimulation. All of this stimulation is taking place within the brain. MTV is a very, I think, a powerful example of this, of just massive stimulation. What's happening, even I think Sesame Street, which is in a lot of ways seen as a very positive thing, I think for teachers it's a disaster. Because you're competing with entertainment. A child begins to think that, you know, you have to be entertained to learn. There has to be these cartoons coming in and this and that, and it all has to be fast. You know, there's a cartoon of a little boy sitting in front of a forest and asking his father, "What's the plot?" Right? So there's this idea, you know, of really, just this culture has become massive stimulation. You know, Toffler's The Fast World. There's a beautiful film called Pawakatsi? Pawakatsi. Is the second one Pawakatsi? Wonderful film by a local filmmaker. And one of the things that he does in there is he's got the third world in slow motion. Right? So you see people like farming in Brazil and things. Traditional farming is all in slow motion. But then when he switches to the, you know, America, it's all fast motion. And it's interesting what he's trying, you know, what he's juxtaposing. Like he showed people eating in fast food restaurants really fast, and it's very, very strong to watch it. But the point being is that we are in a hyper-stimulatory state. What happens with, you reach thresholds, you want more stimulation. Now, there are people now that go out and do things to taste the moment that could become very extreme and violent. Gangbangers. You see, adrenaline junkies. When I was in an intensive care unit, and I used to go down to the ERs sometime, and in the ER room, it's really interesting that what a lot of the nurses that work in ERs and doctors do on the weekends, jump out of airplanes, hang gliding, you know, these jumping, bungee jumping. Because if you work in, you know, intensive care, crack a chest open, you know, cardiac massage, very intense. They really get into the rush of adrenaline and things. And then on the weekend, it's like, you know, what's there to do? That's an interesting phenomenon. Really, it really is. Adrenaline's a very powerful drug. And we forget that there really is an adrenaline, you know, it's a very high drug. Right? And one of the things that happens when people, when they see things that they shouldn't see, you'll get, the heart begins to beat faster. Right? For instance, people that, I mean, they've done studies with people that watch pornography and things like that. Stimulation, rapid heartbeat, adrenaline rushes, things like that. Initially, but then more stimulation. They need more stimulation. Right? And the end result is a snuff film or something like that. Really, there's people that's what they need to be stimulated. These are very serious, from an Islamic worldview, very serious ways of attempting to assuage this emptiness, to feel alive. Now, for the Muslim, the goal in life is to reach a type of tranquility, not the stimulation. It is to reach a point where the stimulation is not needed for one to feel alive. That what one feels alive through a peace, an inner peace, which is achieved through worship. Through you know, prayer and these things. So the dunya is the worldly existence, and the dunya also has 7 stages. The first stage is the infantile stage. Now it's interesting, the word in Arabic for the child is ghulam. The first stage of dunya is ghulam, which means lusty. That's what it means, ghulma, to lust. And this is the infantile state. There's a lust, there's a desire. And then it moves into the young adulthood. That ghulam goes to about 15 years of age, from birth to 15 years. and then young adulthood, which is where hopefully the child has been humanized in that first 15 years of life, to where that they're safe to the society and they're safety to themselves. Then it moves to what's called the kahl, or the middle-aged person.
What's the second stage called? First is lusty, second is?
The second is, it would be like moving into what's called shabab, and it relates to fire. The second is shabab, and it comes from a root word which means fire. So this is where you have the fire of life. The first would be spring, the second would be like summer. There's a fire, it's heat, it's intensity, there's a lot of energy to do things. The third stage is reaching the kahl, which is related to maturity. It's related to productivity, where the person, now the fire has been used usefully, right? So there's something cooked there. There's been something cooked, and it's something worthwhile now. There's benefit to be had. And then you go into the fourth, which is the adulthood, which is a rajul or imra'a, which is full. And this begins at 40, right? This begins at about 35, small window here. So youth is from about 15 to 35. This is 1 to 15. 40 is a very important year in the Islamic view, because it's when the human being is at their full maturity. The intellect is fully mature. The body has reached its full maturity. And now, from this point, you go into the fifth one is where you reach at about 60, and you go into what's called the Shaykh period, where the person is now like an elder, somebody who they have wisdom, they have a type of presence within the society that is beneficial. Shaykh, S-H-A-I-K-H. And then, there's a stage here that's broken up, which would lead to 7, which is the sabi, which is the infant, first 5 years or first 7 years. But the last and final stage is called the ajuz. And it's interesting that the male and the female are the same. There's no differentiation. It's a male, the word for ajuz applies to the male and the female. And this is beyond, this is where they've entered like 75, 80 years of age. There's a transcendence of the gender at this point. There's a type of, in fact, in the Islamic culture, traditionally, at about 60, the woman will begin to, there's open mixing in many, many cultures, traditionally, as the woman enters into that period of life. She's considered like, there's a wisdom that she should be present, that she should be in that environment. And then ajuz is that last phase. Now death is the third stage. Now the Quran says some people die early and others, Allah gives them, extends their life. If a person dies before puberty, they're not taken into account at all. And they're considered for paradise generally. That is the majority view. If they die after puberty, they're taken into account for their actions. So death is the next. Now, just to give you a scenario of what the Muslims believe happens at death. At the initial point of death, it is believed that the spirit leaves the body and hovers above the body. Now, if you look at the word for spirit in Arabic, it is ruh, which comes from a word rih. Now, spiritus in Latin also comes from a word that means wind. The idea is that the wind is not something you see, but you feel its effects. You see its effects. You see the leaves moving. So the ruh is not something we can see, but we feel the effects of the soul. The soul is powerful. When the soul departs from the body, and one of the things highly encouraged in Islam is to wash dead bodies, right? Because you prepared for the prayer. It's very powerful, especially if you know the person, because you're in the presence. You see the absence of the soul. You see the absence of the soul. The body is there, but it is not, the soul is missing. That is not the same person that you knew in your life.
Well, it doesn't say that, no, I don't mean, let me figure out how to ask this question. How does one account for the apparent same phenomenon of animals? They die, they're animals.
Because animals have soul as well, according to Islam. Okay. Yes, definitely. All things in the world are animated by spirit. Everything, including rocks. The Muslims believe that all the way down that there is a penetration of this divine substance that Allah has animated the world with. That's why everything is a sign of God. If not, if there wasn't this spiritual element within creation, then it would not be a sign of God. It would be absence, it would be death and other. So that's a good point. And Muslims believe that animals are raised up as well on the Day of Judgment. And Muslims believe that animals bear witness against people that abuse them. Right? Humane societies kind of have the hadith there, right? There's actually a hadith that the whole earth is raised up. And there's a hadith that people that oppress the earth will have 7 earths around their neck on the Day of Judgment. The Prophet said whoever pollutes a river is, it's like they're cursed to do something like that, to spoil something. He cursed anyone that took hunting as a sport. In other words, they didn't eat the food, they just went out and hunted animals. And he said that there's a reward in showing kindness to anything that has spirit. So, at the point of death, the soul hovers over, and according to the Muslims, the soul says, "Ajiruni, ajiruni," hasten this process. Because this disengagement is very difficult for the soul, to be separate from the body. And then, when the person is placed, they're washed, they're wrapped in a funeral shroud of white cloth. Males wash males, women wash women, unless it's husband and wife. But generally, males wash males, women wash women. And then the body is put into the grave. The grave is dirt. Muslims are not buried in coffins. You're buried in dirt. And it's going back to the earth. Now there is a hadith, there's a story that Khazin tells in his tafsir, Allahu A'lam, and concerning its validity, but it's told and it's an interesting story, that God sent the Israfil, which is Sarafael in the Bible, to go down and get earth, in which Adam would be made from. And the earth refused, which is kind of the nature of the earth, wanting to maintain the integrity, refused. And then so another angel went down, earth refused. And then the third angel, which is Azrael, the angel of death, went down and said, "If you give this to me, I promise I'll return it to you." And so the earth was given. And the Prophet said that that the first soul, which contained all of creation, the first soul was created from all the earths of the world. From the white, the black, the red, the difficult, the easy, the fertile, the infertile, all of the earth's, the topsoil. And Adam, in Arabic, in Hebrew one of the means is from blood. But one of the words in Arabic is tawny, and from the topsoil of the earth. So the idea is that the human being is from this topsoil. And so Azrael separates the soul from the body and returns the earth back. And you can look in terms of clay, man being created from clay, scientifically, secondarily, because everything that makes up our body is about 70% water, and the rest of it is coming from the earth through the animals and the vegetables that we eat, right? So we are literally made of earth, and we go back to earth.
Cremation unaccepted?
It's unaccepted in Islam, yes. Although there is an interesting hadith, which is a very sound hadith, of which a man, according to the Prophet Muhammad, a man cremated himself. And God still brought all of his parts together. And then he asked the man why he did it. And the man said that he was so afraid of the Day of Judgment. He was hoping that he wouldn't be resurrected. And so, according to the Prophet Muhammad, God forgave him for that?
There's no embalming, I gather, then?
No. Goes right back into the earth, and preferably the first day. At the point it enters into the grave, the next stage is the grave. It enters into what's called a barzakh, which is an inner space, and now it's no longer in a time-space continuum that we are in. And the soul is reunited with the body. I mean, it's not coming back to life. If you dig up the grave, you know, this is going to be a dead person there. But the soul is reunited with the body. And consciousness is there. And then the grave is either a place in which a window is open to the garden or a window is open to the fire, depending on the individual. And then there is a questioning in the grave. There are two angels, Munkar and Nakir, that come to the grave and question the people. The first question is, who is your Lord? And the second question is, who is your prophet? And the third question is, what is your religion? The fifth is what's called the nafkha. Which is that Israfil is the angel that is assigned to resurrection. The first nafkha, which is like, it means literally a blowing. The first blowing is all of the souls die. All of them. So there is an idea that life will stop. And the Qur'an says that just as the universe was expanded, it will be contracted at the end. In scientific terms, kind of like the big crunch, right? That it all comes back. And there is an idea of heat meltdown as well, because it says the oceans boil over, the mountains melt, everything is, there's a heat death. That's the Qur'an definitely gives an idea of a heat death at the end of time. And then the second nafkha is the resurrection. That there is a resurrection of the souls. And everybody is brought to a plane, which is similar to Arafah. And then the Qiyamah takes place, which is the day of standing. Now the Prophet Muhammad said that this is a day in which people literally some people will be up to here in their own sweat. It's a very intense day of accountability. And everybody says, nafsi, nafsi. Everybody says, me, me. And there's a hadith that a child will go to the parent and say, help me, and the parent says, me, me. That this is a day in which everybody is concerned with their own souls. And then the next stage is what is called the reckoning. According to the Islamic tradition, your entire life will be placed before you. You will see all of your actions, and you will be called to account and asked to defend yourself. And according to the Islamic tradition, it says, you'll know when your excuses are lame. It says, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ بَصِيرًا وَلَوْ أَلْقَى مَعَاذِيرًا. On that day, the human being knows very clearly all of his... In other words, the human being knows very clearly all of his... In other words, if you want to look at it in psychological terms, all of your defense mechanisms are suddenly removed. Your projection, your denial, all of these psychological mechanisms that we've used very well in this world to justify our actions are taken away from us. And it says in Surah Al-Qaf that on that day the veil is removed from your eyes and your eyesight is piercing. So you will see things very clear. And there's an idea that we all know in truth if we will reflect what we're up to. So each person is taken to account. And the Prophet Muhammad said that every people will be behind their prophet. So the people of Moses will be behind Moses, the people of Jesus behind Jesus, the people of Muhammad behind Muhammad, the people of Karl Marx behind Karl Marx. Everybody's going to be behind their imam, the one they took as their example in this world. And it's interesting because the Quran says that the oppressed will say to the oppressors, you got us here. And the oppressors will say, we didn't do anything, you followed us. And so there's this kind of conflict between them. And each one will say, I don't want anything to do with you in the next world. So there's an idea of really everybody awakens to the truth of their own souls, to the truth of their own selves. And then it's said that there is, after the reckoning, there's the weighing in the balance. Once everything has been shown, then actions are put into scales. And the scholars say Allah knows best what their reality. And if the right actions outweigh the bad, then you are given a book in your right hand, and is the book of your actions. And if the wrong actions outweigh, then you're given a book in your left hand. At that point, then you go to what is called a sirat, which is the plain. It is a bridge over which the valley of Jahannam is. And the bridge in the tradition says that it's more piercing, it's more sharp than a sword. And everybody will have to go across this bridge, everyone. And there are angels on the bridge that shout to people. And the Prophet Muhammad said that there are people that will go like light. They'll go the speed of light across the bridge. He said, kabarq, like a lightning, they go right across it. There's other people, he said, that will go like a wind. There's other people, he said, that will go running. There's other people that will go walking. There's other people that will go crawling. And then there's other people that will not make it across into the pit. And then at the other side of the sirat, there's what's called a hawd. And the hawd is a huge basin. And according to the tradition, anyone who drinks from it will never have thirst after that. And there is also a tradition that on that day, the death is brought before everybody in the form of a lamb and is slaughtered. And so there's no death after that.
The ones that don't make it, the ones that don't make it across the thirsting.
Thirsting. That's one of the. See, the idea is that only God can quench the thirst. And if one was attempting to quench the thirst in this world by other than God, then they failed in what their task was, which was to be quenched through closeness and not distance. So it goes back to this idea of rahmah, mercy, and wrath, that you bring wrath upon yourself. That's really the idea, that God is not punishing people to punish them. The people literally take themselves to their final destinies. That's very strong in the tradition. Now, some people will not abide in, there are people that leave it. There's an interesting tradition. I mean, this is just a story. But there's an interesting tradition because the Prophet Muhammad said, how people die, that's how they're raised up, and how they're raised up is how they're judged. And there's a story of a woman, they tell that she never did one kind deed, except once she was going into her house and a carrot dropped, and a cat came and took the carrot. And this is based on a hadith that the Prophet said there will be people punished because they did not feed animals that were in their responsibility, that they're actually punished for that. It's like a responsibility. And so this person was going to go get the carrot, and they just decided, no, I'll let the cat have it. And so they're in the pit of fire, and a carrot comes down. And so they hold on to the carrot, and they start getting pulled up out of the fire on this carrot. But then she looks down, and there's other people coming out holding on to her. So before you know it, there's a whole string of people getting pulled out of the fire because of this one carrot. And then she starts saying, no, this is my carrot. And she slips and falls back in. So it's just giving you an idea of that people, how they are in this world, it's going to be confirmed in the next world. that their miserliness. Now there is a hadith that a prostitute, and it's a sahih hadith, that a prostitute went to a well and got water up from the well. And she saw a thirsty dog. And she said, this dog is thirsty like I am. So she put her shoe down and brought water up and quenched the thirst of the dog. And the Prophet said for that she was forgiven and given paradise. There's another tradition that says that a man, he used to loan money. And he would tell his agents, go out and ask to be repaid. And if they don't have the money, tell them not to worry about it. And so the Prophet said that when that man is brought before God, God says, I'm more generous than this man in forgiving his debtors. And He forgives him. So if you look in the Islamic tradition, there's very, very strong emphasis on forgiveness and rahmah. But there's also an emphasis on wrath. There's a balance here. Even though the Muslims say God's rahmah is over His wrath. And there's a tradition that says that God's mercy is 99 parts. And only one part did He send down to the earth. And by that part of mercy, a mother shows mercy to her child. A foal raises its leg. The mare raises its leg from stepping on the foal. So the idea is that all of the mercy in this world that we see is only one small portion of the mercy of God. So there is a strong emphasis on God's mercy. But there's also a strong emphasis on the wrath.
What happens about, say, your citizenship in a country causes problems, pollution, death?
Right.
And would it be part of that citizenship?
I think there's definitely accountability on all levels. Muslims believe in accountability, that complacency is, the Prophet said, being silent about something is showing contentment with it. So if you're silent about a thing, it means that you're complicit in the action. So unless to speak out against it would endanger your life. So there is an idea that people who feel that I can't, if I speak out they're going to kill me or something like that, they're forgiven. Although the Prophet said the greatest jihad is to speak the truth in front of an unjust ruler. That is the greatest jihad. So there is definitely an idea of responsibility in one's actions and in what does. And politics is a problem. Henry Thoreau, he got arrested for not paying his taxes because he felt, the government supports slavery and he didn't want to support a government. And they say that Emerson went there, visited him in the jail, and he said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Henry said, the question is, what are you doing out there? That we do have a social responsibility.
Does the Quran or Hadith mention suicide?
Yes. And I'll tell you something really interesting about that. There's a book called Life After Life by Raymond Moody, and there's a section in there about suicide in which he mentions a woman who committed suicide. She was actually declared dead, but then she was brought back to life after blood transfusions. And he interviewed her and asked her what happened. She said she found herself doing it over and over again. And the hadith, according to the Prophet Muhammad, said if anyone who commits suicide will continue to do that with the same intensity until the Day of Judgment. Although it is not considered a kufr. In other words, the person is not. If a Muslim commits suicide, they're still Muslim. They're buried as a Muslim. But it's one of the worst things that you can do.
Also, if the balance of the mind is genuinely disturbed, they're not held accountable.
No, absolutely. If somebody anybody who is out of their mind is not held to account by Sharia, right? Half the 20th century.
What standard though? If they're out of their mind, do we need the full witnesses?
No. In other words, if somebody was clinically depressed to the point where they were non-functional, the accountability, it's hard for the accountability to be, those things, it's just difficult. They're gray areas. But the idea is that if they really are not functioning, that accountability is based on sound intellect. That is part of accountability. And this again, like in Islam, you have somebody who's all their life they've been punished. Since their time they were born, beaten as a child and all these things. They become sociopathic or From an Islamic point of view, when they reach adulthood, they're accountable. In real terms, we would say, Allahu A'lam, what's going to happen on the Day of Judgment. Because the Prophet said many parents will be taken to account for what they did to their children. You see? Because it is the parents' response. It's a trust. That's why parenthood is so strong in Islam. You know, it's because it's a divine trust. Children are a trust in the hands of the parents. And if they betray the trust, then they can destroy the children. I'm going to open up to question, discussion.
If a child dies before puberty, do they go right to heaven?
According to the tradition, Abraham takes care of the children who die, the children whose parents are for paradise. Abraham takes care of those children in his hadana. It's called hadana.
When the woman came to the Prophet to ask forgiveness for Muhammad, it wasn't Muhammad she forgave.
He can't forgive. Yeah, it's not like, I mean, in the Christian tradition, there's some verses that would indicate, like Jesus said, go and sin no more, for you're forgiven. And that was seen as kind of a blasphemy to the Jews. From the Muslim point of view, they would say, Allahu A'lam, if that is a true account of Jesus, they would say that is not Jesus forgiving, but rather God revealing to him that the woman's actions were forgiven. Because the Prophet did tell people they were forgiven. But he does not forgive. The Prophet does not absolve people's sins. It is God alone who forgives. The Prophet is seen as a human being. He's a man. He does not have divine... he is a human being like the rest of us in his human nature, but not like the rest of us in that he's a prophet. So some of them said, a ruby is a rock, but it's not like other rocks. It's a mineral, but it's not like other minerals.
I'm having a tough time trying to reconcile the issue of slandering a prophet with equaling a death sentence in Islamic law with some of the things you just said, i.e. that prophets are merely men. And also something else that I think I've heard in that hadith or granted, that people find God in their own time. It might be 16 for this person, maybe it's 40 years of age. So how, if that's true...
Well, there would be no... Because, if you slander another human being, you're whipped in Islam. In other words, if I accuse somebody in here of adultery, the Islamic punishment is that I'm whipped.
Okay.
Because that is prohibited to do that. And there's very severe consequences for it because of its impact on society. If you do something to a prophet, it's very serious. With the idea that the prophets are impeccable in their character. That they are people that have only brought good for human beings. And if you do want to say something about them, then you say it not in the public space, in the private space. In other words, that's again between you and God. But if you bring that out into the public space, then it creates a type of tension in the society that is very serious according to the Muslims.
And I'd like to add to that many of the people that persecuted the Prophet,
he forgave them.
Absolutely physical persecution.
Yeah, he forgave them.
Became Muslims themselves.
And he forgave them. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, if it was a non-Muslim who did it, see, it's very different. If it's a non-Muslim who did it, it goes under a different category than if a Muslim did it. Do you see what I mean? In other words, this law relates to Muslims who say bad things about the Prophet ﷺ.
I think also, in terms of you reconciling and understanding what you said before about the entire Sharia being in place in an Islamic setting is a pretty important piece in terms of understanding how that can possibly be a reality for the punishment. It's not like some one of us here is blasting the Prophet and that will be a lot of punishment for Islamic law. I mean, maybe you just emphasize that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that does not hold for non-Islamic people?
No, it's prohibited in Islamic law for a person to do that, to blaspheme any prophet, right? But for a Muslim, it's a death penalty. For a non-Muslim, they are tried, and if they become Muslim, right? If it was towards the Prophet Muhammad, then it's not. If they don't, and they say, that they adhere to that, because it's prohibited for the Muslims even to curse false gods in the Quran. It says, "لا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم." Do not curse the false gods of other people. And that came later. Initially, the Muslims were saying bad things about the gods. So even for a Muslim, they're not supposed to make fun of Hindu objects of worship. Right? Like laugh about Krishna or Vishnu or Shiva. See, we're not supposed to do that. If it's in the private space, that's another matter. But publicly, I should not do that. I should not disparage what other people hold sacred.
Just to bring it back to what you started with before. You see, these things happen in some Muslim societies. But that is not Islam. It may be Muslims who are completely getting wrong what Islam is supposed to be.
Right. Uh-huh.
I'm a little mixed up. If a Muslim, the girl in the West Side last week that drew those pictures of Muhammad as a kid drawing around,
I didn't know about that, but I think somebody mentioned it.
She's Jewish, she's immigrating from Russia, she's in jail now in Israel for fomenting religious discord.
Right.
Is there a follow-up put out against her?
Well, see,
I heard that in the news.
Oh, I don't know what's going on there. I mean, the problem is, for me personally, there is no now in the Muslim world, there is not any government that is implementing Islamic law. Not one. None. Zero. Sudan, I don't know. I mean, I'm not there, and I don't know. But I'd be amazed if they were.
But because she's not Muslim, I don't understand. If a Muslim...
She would be, in a Muslim country, if that happened, she would be taken to, there would be a trial. It goes against it's like a blasphemy. It goes under those laws, right?
Do all those Muslim countries contend that they are implementing Islamic law?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Most of them will say that it is the law of the constitution or the state, but none of them do. I think probably the only ones that would claim to is Arabia, like what they call Saudi Arabia now, Sudan, and maybe Afghanistan would probably claim that they do also. And Iran. But I'm going to get into, when I talk about the end of time and how the Muslims view, I'm going to get into that, really discussing really how the Muslims view this period of time traditionally. So, is it 12 now?
12:16.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And so just to continue on a little bit with where we were, because I didn't really finish the second part. If we look at the hadith in the 40 hadiths, which is really what I've been dealing with all along, the hadith talks about, there's actually 4 subjects. The first subject is Islam, which we covered. And the second one was Iman, which we covered at a very basic level. And the third one is called Ihsan. Now, if we look at it in terms of dimensionality, the first dimension is Islam. That's the first dimension, which would relate to like a vertical dimension, or horizontal rather. The second dimension is Iman, which would be the dimension of height. So you have breadth and height. And the third dimension is Ihsan, which would be related to depth. So here's our 3-dimensionality there in the tradition. Now the last question in the hadith is about the end of time. So here we bring in the 4th dimension, which is time. So in this hadith, we're looking at 4 dimensions within the tradition. Modern Islam has focused on Islam, and I'm using Islam as a rubric for Islam being the outward, Iman being the inward, and Ihsan being the transcendent or the universal aspect. And then finally, the idea of time and how it translates into the world. So the reason there's been an incredible focus on Islam in the modern world has a lot to do with the post-colonial condition. Now if you look, the Muslims, unlike other traditions, were very successful. If you look at the first 13 years, there was tribulation, there was hardship, but after the first 13 years, you really have a religion that had an extraordinary amount of worldly success. Within 100 some odd years, they had literally reached most of the known world. And although the Battle of Tours, which marks the stop of Islam's Western movement by Charles Martel, the fact is that really was not, according to the Muslims historians, was not a significant defeat. The Muslims weren't particularly interested at that time moving any more north, and they actually went back into Spain, and really kind of Spain was an extraordinary place. Northern Europe was dark. It was there was a lot of clouds. These were mostly people that were coming from the middle part of the world. And so they went back into Spain and spent several hundred years there developing extraordinary civilization. Then there's two major events. One, the fall of Cordoba, which really sent repercussions throughout the Muslim world, because Cordoba became an extraordinary center of learning in the Muslim world. And within 100 years, you've got the fall of Baghdad at the hands of the Mughals. Massive impact. This is the heartland that is defeated. And this is the first time that the Muslims really felt defeat in a very, very powerful and traumatic way. Nonetheless, energies are regrouped. The Mughals will become Muslims, actually reinvigorating the tradition. Spain becomes a thorn in the side. Lamenting poets to this day. There are Arab poets that write about Spain and the loss of Spain to this day. Spain is very much in the Muslim consciousness to this day. It's odd for us to think about this, right? But really the Muslims do feel a sense of grief and loss when Andalusia is mentioned, Al-Andalus. Now, what you see happen when Napoleon reaches Egypt, and literally, it's interesting enough, he sends a letter to the Egyptians off the shore, telling them he hasn't come to destroy the Quran or the Islamic teachings, but to honor them. And it's kind of odd. But then he comes in, he invades Egypt, and the Mamluks put up an extraordinary fight, but they were grossly outnumbered in terms of technology. The weaponry was much more sophisticated. You're dealing with people that were still fighting with swords and things, and they were coming up against very serious technological advancement. When Egypt feels that, right, Napoleon's eventually defeated in Palestine and moves back, but there is a very traumatic experience within the Muslim world, the idea of Egypt being attacked and actually for a short period of time succumbs to the colonial power. And you just start seeing the colonial incursion increasing. North Africa begins to become defeated, different places. Now, the Muslims were looking for a reason to try to understand this, because for centuries in their psyche, this is God's religion, we're the defenders of God's one true religion, right? And now we're actually being defeated. Different responses. Some of them said, clearly a sign of the end of time. There's a hadith, which is a verifiable, sound hadith from the Prophet Muhammad. There will come a time in which the great nations of the West will attack my ummah and eat from them, in other words, devour their riches like people eat from a plate of food. Sound hadith. Many Muslims started using this to say, well, this is fulfillment of prophecy. Other Muslims said, this is too defeatist, and began to explain it in terms of technological superiority. What we did is we abandoned our tradition right, of research, of trying to investigate the world. For the first 3-4 centuries of Islam, there was a lot of scientific development and achievement. In the 6th century, a theologian named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali wrote a book which was an attack on the philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa. The incoherence of the philosophers has a very strong impact in the Muslim world. The philosophers were not simply just how we view them now, but philosophers of those times were also scientists. There was natural philosophy. The book was a very strong attack on this tradition, saying that in a sense that people were investigating things that they really had no purpose investigating, that there was too much speculation, and that there were also elements involved in philosophy and the study of philosophy that led to a type of, well, could lead to disbelief potentially. So there is a refutation within 100 years by another great philosopher, theologian, and jurist like al-Ghazali, who himself was very well versed in the philosophy of his time, Ibn Rushd, who's called Averroes, and he wrote a book, Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, which was his attack on Imam al-Ghazali. This book is rejected in the Muslim world. He's a very interesting character, and the Europeans become, there was a very strong school in the Middle Ages, the Averroes school, of which Thomas Aquinas, whose teacher Albertus Magnus, is heavily influenced by Ibn Rushd, Averroes. And he actually, the commentaries, Ibn Rushd wrote 3 commentaries on Aristotle, the small, the middle, or the lesser, the middle, and the greatest, for 3 levels of understanding. And these are translated into Latin and spread quite rapidly in Europe. So the Europeans began to take the rational model at the same time that the Muslims are rejecting it. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So basically, there was a group of Muslims, particularly in 19th century Egypt, who begin to say, this is our problem. We abandoned the rationalist model and took this super-rationalist or spiritual model, and we've forgotten the world. Whereas the Christians, who for centuries abandoned the world, took this rational model and begin to explore the world, to discover the secrets of the world, and ultimately gain power and ascendancy in a way that now even the heartland of Islam is threatened and being defeated. And so they created a type of neo-rationalist school, right? And within that school, probably the greatest proponent is an Egyptian reformist named Muhammad Abdu, who becomes Shaykh al-Azhar in 1900. He takes the Azhari school, which is really this is the Harvard of the Muslim world. He takes that school and begins to introduce modernist ideas, that Islam needs to be reformed. So you get reformers, and there becomes a secularization of Islam. The Muslims become embarrassed of their spiritual tradition. In the spiritual tradition, there was a lot of belief in the miracles of the saints, in the idea of sainthood, what's called wilaya in the Arabic language, of a very strong tradition of not becoming too engaged in the world, taking only from the world what you need, and really not being extravagant and things like that, and really seeing this as something related to the very core of Islam, and using the Prophet ﷺ as the example, as the model of somebody who was not deeply engaged in the world, although he was a worldly prophet in the sense that he was very concerned with society, with justice in society, with establishing a strong social basis for his teaching. Despite that, his own personal life was one of, in a sense, a deep abandonment of the luxuries of the world. There's a famous tradition, he slept on a mat on the floor, and they said that the palm fibers used to be shown, the traces of it on his face. And once Omar was sitting with him, and he began to weep, and he asked Omar, why are you weeping? And he said, because I've been to Syria and seen how the Roman rulers live in the opulence, and then I look at you, the Prophet of God, living like this. It makes me sad. And the Prophet smiled at him and said, aren't you pleased that this is, for them, they have this world, and for us is the next world? This type of, within the Islamic tradition, was very, very much the norm until the late 19th century. And so you get a change. And so now what you will find, and there's a book I really would recommend, given that, in a sense, you're becoming now, within, certainly in the American framework, experts on Islam, right? After you finish this 2 weeks, you will be considered within your schools and within your environments to have a type of expertise about Islam that other people don't have, that's one, a very important responsibility, and two, a type of absurdity, as we all know, right? Because none of us, I did my degree at the University in Comparative Religions, and, you can't, any one religion, I haven't even explored Islam to its fullest, anywhere near it. Buddhism is just an incredible tradition, massive intellectual tradition, massive spiritual tradition, and if I spent my entire life just studying Buddhism, I would not exhaust even probably one of the schools of Buddhism. So this is true of any religion that has any substance to it, and certainly Islam is, it is one of the greatest of the religions of man, if not, but certainly the Muslims would consider it, but even I think many secularist historians would consider it certainly either the first or the second. Christianity will be in there, depending on which historian you're looking at. Michael Hart definitely considered it, of all the Prophet Muhammad, as being the most successful religious teacher in the history of human societies, the impact that he's had on cultures and civilizations. So the point of all this is that the book that I was going to recommend, is called The Failure of Political Islam by Roy Olivier. I think it's a brilliant book. He's not a Muslim. He's a French intellectual who originally did studies in Afghanistan. But he really studied very seriously the modern political scene in the Muslim world. And I think he gives a brilliant analysis of what's called fundamentalism. It's called The Failure of Political Islam by Roy Olivier. Roy Olivier. It's French. If you're used to reading French intellectuals, it's got a little bit of that in there. They tend to be abstruse, almost purposely. But the basic gist of his argument is that what happened within the Muslim world is that there was a radical secularization within the elite, the intellectual elites of the Muslim world. Many of them adopted socialism and communism as ways of dealing with colonialism. You will see Algeria is a good example of this, right? Ahmed Ben Bella, Boumediene. These are, the revolutionaries that free their countries from the yoke of colonialism. Another example is Libya, right? The Jamahiriya. He's a socialist in his views. Jamal Abdel Nasser, who's kind of switching back and forth, but basically a socialist worldview. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, a communist organization, right, from inception. The idea was definitely the oppressed versus the oppressed within a dialectical, this Marxist dialectic. Well, with also Iraq, the Ba'athist Party, socialist. Syria, socialist. We forget this, that how deeply this Marxist idea moves into the Muslim world. Yemen, communist. The communists take over Yemen. Communism traditionally has seen religion as an enemy, the opiate of the masses. This in the Muslim world was a little more difficult because of the depth of the sacred tradition still within those. And so the type of communism, the socialism, there's almost let's reinterpret our tradition. The Prophet was a communist, right? And some of the Western people said this about Jesus, the original communitarian. The disciples are giving up all their possessions for the poor. So you get, and now you have within the Catholic Church a very strong Marxist tradition, liberation theology. Sandinistas, many of the people within the Sandinista were very devout. Ernesto Cardenal was a Jesuit priest. He becomes the minister of culture in Nicaragua. So within the Catholic Church, particularly in the so-called oppressed lands like Brazil and these places, you find within Christianity a Marxist redaction of the Christian teaching. And it's very appealing. You mix Marxism and Christianity to the masses, or Marxism it becomes very appealing if you're oppressed. And suddenly your oppression doesn't have to be a materialistic, but now you can be oppressed for the sake of God. Right? It's a little easier to bear than purely a. So what happens is as communism begins to crumble, right? People, what are we going to do? Socialism fails. It fails in Algeria. It fails in Egypt. It fails in Iraq. It fails in Syria. Well, Islam. Whoa, why didn't we see this before? Right? We used to be great. We had the Bani Umayyah. We had the Abbasids. We had the Ottoman Empire. Hey, we were great. We were ruling the world. You know, people looked at us. We were the superpower. We were the big guy on the block. You know. And why was that? Well, because God's grace was on us. Right? And a lot of Americans believe this. Right? I mean, Reagan was very much in that vein of manifest destiny. America has a divine mission. Right? The Americans, God bless America. Right? There is an idea that when somebody's up at the top, that you know, God sheds His grace on us. This is divine grace. I mean, we wouldn't have all this stuff if God wasn't pleased with us. Which is alien to the Quranic worldview, by the way. The Quran says if God gives man a lot, then man says, oh, God's pleased with me. And if He gives him a hard time, man says, He's angry at me, He's upset with me. Whereas from the Quranic worldview, the testing is good and evil. You're tested with want and abundance. That they're both tests from God. So what happens within the Muslim world is that suddenly all these people that were Marxists in the 1970s are becoming radical Islamists of the 1980s. I mean, quite literally. You know, and you change the vocabulary because it's very similar. Political slogans aren't that different. I mean, you could start shouting about freedom in Islam, well, you can shout about freedom as a communist, and not a whole lot of difference. And so what happens is you get a lot of young people coming into these movements, these political movements, that are basically emphasizing social justice. Very little emphasis on the traditional teaching of Islam, which deals with 3 dimensions. There is a focus on one dimension, which is Islam. And this is why you have a great deal of one-dimensional Islam in the Muslim world. The problem with focusing on one dimension, and particularly the outward dimension, is religious people are very often unpleasant people to be around. Right? That has been my experience. My life on this planet, some of the worst people that I've ever been around are religious people, and feeling much more comfortable with a secular humanist. Although I've been around some very rabid fundamentalist secular humanists as well, right? Because you get both sides. But I think definitely within the religious tradition, the great danger of religion is religiosity, right? With self-righteousness, with being judgmental, with suddenly, I'm right, you're all wrong. God's on my side, He's not on your side. This is a real trap for any practitioner of a religious teaching. And it is certainly a trap within the Islamic tradition, just as it is in every other tradition. I don't sense in any way that it was the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad's teaching. You know, I'll give you an example of one of the Tabi'een, second generation, to ask one of the Sahaba. He said, we had a woman who died amongst us who died without a mahram. And should we, in other words, she didn't have a relative. She was living alone. And he said, so should we wash her and bury her? And the man just said to her, you know, we didn't make things that difficult during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, bury the poor woman, you know, and give me a break, right? In other words, what happens is the spirit of the law gets lost with the letter of the law. And Islam is a tradition that really is trying to unify the idea of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. That you cannot have one without the other. If there's too much justice, you end up with wrath. If there's too much mercy, you end up with a type of social chaos. So the Islamic teaching is trying to join these two. The problem with a modern Islam is there is a massive focus on wrath, on anger. And this is what would be termed in the Nietzschean worldview as the slave mentality of resentment. That the oppressed suddenly has a special status within human society because of the experience of suffering. I am suffering and you are not. Therefore, I am ipso facto better than you. Right? This is a real trap in the human psyche. You see, because you're not suffering the way I am, I'm better than you. And no moral superiority, no superiority of action, simply by the one fundamental issue of suffering. And this is a trap, and this is what Roy Olivier says is the real crisis of the Muslim world, as long as they stay in this framework, as long as they have this mentality, they can't pull themselves up. It's a completely disempowering condition to be in, you see. This is what Warithuddin Muhammad, W.D. Muhammad once said, talking about within this culture, for the African American to be demanding reparations, to be demanding, I've got 400 years of injustice, and I'm not going to do anything until you rectify the wrongs that have been done to me. What W.D. Muhammad said about that, he said, this is like a man who's literally been mugged. He's left there dying on the ground. A man comes and offers him his hand to pick him up, and he says, no, I'm not getting up until the guy that did this comes back and apologizes to me. That is a disempowering situation, because the guy that did that is most likely not going to come back and apologize to you, and you will wallow in your self-pity because people are not going to help you up. Right? And this is really, in many ways, I think, the condition of the Muslim world. So I've just kind of put this in a context in order to go into the next realm of Islam, which is called ihsan, because it is probably, of all the teachings of Islam, the most forgotten. And traditionally, it went under the category of what is called, in the West, Sufism.